I flew 15 hours from Dubai just to attend my sister's wedding. But the moment I stepped into the grand foyer of the Hamptons estate, my own parents blocked the entrance. "Only family is allowed inside," my mother sneered. "You were not invited, so leave." Heartbroken and drenched in rain, I turned away. 3 days later, my mother called me in an absolute panic. "The venue bill is $45,000, she screamed. "How will you pay for it?" I simply laughed and told her a secret that made her gasp for air. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who underestimated your worth. My name is Melanie, 33 years old, and until that rainy Saturday in New York, I still held on to a tiny shred of hope that my family could change. I am the founder and CEO of a luxury property management network, a life I built completely on my own after my family wrote me off as a failure. The rain was coming down in sheets as my private car pulled up to the sprawling Hamptons estate. I had just landed at the airport after a grueling 15-hour flight from Dubai. My body was aching from days of intense corporate negotiations, my internal clock was completely shattered, and my trench coat was soaked through the shoulders just from the short walk up the stone driveway. But I was determined to be there. It was my younger sister Ashley's wedding day. Despite a lifetime of being treated as the family scapegoat, I still believed that showing up for the people you love mattered. I paid my driver, stepping onto the massive marble porch of the estate. The venue was breathtaking, a historic mansion converted into a premier luxury event space. I could hear the faint sound of a string quartet warming up inside, playing a soft classical melody that drifted through the heavy oak doors. As I pushed open the double doors and stepped into the grand foyer, I expected to see a chaotic rush of bridesmaids or wedding coordinators checking last-minute details. Instead, I saw my mother Patricia and my father Richard standing shoulder to shoulder like prison guards. They were dressed in impeccable custom formal wear. My mother wore a silver-beaded gown that caught the light of the crystal chandeliers, and my father wore a sharp-tailored tuxedo. The moment Patricia saw me, her fake socialite smile vanished instantly. She marched right up to me, her heels clicking aggressively against the polished marble floor. She crossed her arms, her eyes sweeping over my damp trench coat and practical travel shoes with absolute disgust. "What are you doing here?" Patricia demanded. Her voice kept deliberately low but dripping with pure venom. "I came to see my sister get married," I said, keeping my tone steady despite the immediate knot forming in my stomach. I caught the red eye from Dubai the second my meetings ended. I just wanted to support her on her big day. Patricia scoffed, a harsh sound that echoed in the cavernous entryway. "Support her by showing up unannounced and ruining her aesthetic. Only family is allowed inside, Melanie. You were not invited." I stared at her, the cold reality of her words washing over me. I am family, Mom. I am her older sister. "Not today. You are not my father," Richard chimed in, stepping forward to flank my mother. "Ashley is marrying into a family of elite real estate developers. They are high society, Melanie. We cannot have a college dropout wandering around making us look like fools." The casual cruelty of his words was a familiar weapon, one they had used against me for years. I did not drop out of college because I was lazy or incapable. I dropped out because my parents drained my college tuition fund to pay for Ashley's luxury car and her European backpacking trips. They had forced me to leave school to survive on my own, working multiple jobs just to pay my rent, while they funded my sister's lavish lifestyle. I paid for my own last-minute flight. I told them, my hands trembling slightly at my sides. "I did not ask you for a dime to get here. I just want to sit quietly in the back and watch her walk down the aisle. I will not even go to the reception." "You have always been the embarrassment of this family," Richard retorted, stepping closer so I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "Ashley's new in-laws are mingling in the ballroom right now. If they see you, if they ask what you do with your life, what are you going to say? That you are still jumping from job to job, struggling to get by. Your presence here is a complete liability to her new marriage." He waved his hand dismissively toward the door. "Leave now before I have you thrown out." Several guests from the groom's side were beginning to filter through the nearby hallways. I could see them pointing and whispering, their eyes lingering on my wet coat and the aggressive posture of my parents. I felt the heat of humiliation rising in my cheeks as the whispers grew louder. You would rather kick your own daughter out into the cold rain than risk looking less than perfect in front of absolute strangers. I stated, my voice completely devoid of the tears they were probably expecting to see. We are protecting Ashley's future, Patricia hissed, glancing nervously at the whispering guests. She motioned to a pair of large security guards standing near the coat check area. I will not ask you again, Melanie. Get out, or security will physically remove you from the premises. At that exact moment, I saw Ashley walk past the end of the hallway. She was wearing her pristine white wedding gown surrounded by a flock of bridesmaids. She looked right at me, made direct eye contact, and then simply turned her head away, pretending she did not see me. She let our parents do the dirty work. The old me, the girl who constantly sought their approval and begged for their love, would have broken down sobbing right there in the foyer. I would have begged for a chance to just peek into the ballroom to celebrate my sister. But the woman standing in that foyer was not the terrified college dropout they remembered. The years of struggling, of building my business from the ground up, of turning late nights into a global empire, had forged a completely different person. I straightened my posture, pulling my shoulders back and lifting my chin. I reached into my leather tote bag and retrieved my wallet, pulling out my black American Express card. I handed it directly to the head valet, who had just rushed in with my wet umbrella. Make sure my driver is compensated for waiting out in this weather, I told the valet smoothly, my voice projecting absolute calm and authority. I turned my gaze back to my parents, looking them dead in the eye. I hope the wedding is everything you can afford, I said softly. I turned on my heel and walked back out through the heavy oak double doors, stepping back into the freezing rain. The damp air hit my face, but I did not feel sad or rejected. As I walked down the long, winding gravel driveway toward my waiting town car, I took a much closer look at my surroundings. I noticed the massive catering vans parked near the service entrance. I looked at the floral delivery trucks unloading thousands of expensive white roses. I observed the dark uniforms of the private security guards patrolling the perimeter of the estate. Every single vehicle, every uniform, every piece of equipment bore a subtle, elegant silver crest. It was a crest I had designed myself on a napkin 5 years ago. It was the logo of Vanguard Hospitality, the multi-million-dollar luxury property management network that I founded and currently own. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face as the rain washed over my shoulders. My parents had just thrown me out of a venue they were renting from my own company. They were hosting an outrageously expensive wedding, desperately trying to impress elite real estate developers on a property that I controlled entirely. I slid into the back of my luxury car, wiping the rain from my face and pulling out my laptop, perfectly ready to let them dig their own financial grave. Sitting in the quiet warmth of the town car, I opened my laptop and connected to the secure server for my company. I watched the lavish setup from a distance through the tinted windows, observing the valet parking luxury cars, while the string quartet's music faded into the sound of the rain. I pulled up the venue's master financial ledger. It only took a few clicks to locate the contract for Ashley's wedding. As I scanned the document, my eyes narrowed at the payment terms. They had booked the platinum package, the most expensive tier my estate offered, complete, with imported champagne, caviar stations, and fireworks. But what caught my attention was the guarantor's signature. I made a quick, decisive phone call to my chief operating officer. He answered on the first ring, completely accustomed to my irregular hours. I instructed him to flag Ashley's wedding contract for immediate financial review the second the weekend concluded. I told him not to stop the wedding, but to strictly enforce our most aggressive collection policies the moment the final bill was generated. I wanted them to enjoy every single second of their overpriced caviar and imported champagne. I wanted them to revel in the illusion of their high society status, completely unaware that the very foundation of their grand display belonged to the daughter they had just discarded like trash. Through my brief phone call, the reality of my situation crystallized. I had built this multi-million-dollar empire entirely on my own, relying solely on my grit and determination, while my parents continuously drained their own savings to fund Ashley's frivolous lifestyle. They had mortgaged their future for aesthetics, and now they were quite literally dancing in my house. I ordered the staff to proceed with the event exactly as planned, providing five-star service without exception. I told my driver to take me to the airport. I was flying back to my penthouse in New York City. I would pour myself a glass of vintage wine, sit by the window overlooking the skyline, and wait for the inevitable fallout. They had made their bed with their arrogance and cruelty. Now they were going to have to pay for it. The heavy door of my town car clicked shut. It instantly blocked out the driving rain and the sight of my parents standing guard on the front steps of the Vanguard estate. I settled deep into the plush leather seat and instructed my driver to pull away from the property. As the tires crunched slowly over the manicured gravel driveway, I unclasped my leather tote bag and pulled out my laptop. The soft glow of the screen illuminated the dark interior of the vehicle. I connected to my private mobile network and logged directly into the highly secured server for Apex Hospitality Group. I am the founder and chief executive officer of this entire enterprise. We own and operate 35 of the most exclusive luxury event spaces across the country. The property my parents had just physically barred me from entering was the crown jewel of my East Coast portfolio. I watched the lavish setup continuing from a distance as my car navigated the winding exit road. Through the tinted windows, I could see valet attendants parking exotic sports cars and caterers rushing massive silver trays into the service entrance. I opened the master financial ledger for the Hampton location and typed my sister's name into the client search bar. The contract for Ashley's wedding populated instantly on my screen. I scrolled through the detailed itemized list. My parents had selected the absolute highest tier we offered. They had booked the platinum package. I read through the ridiculous demands they had authorized. There were imported caviar stations, a 10-tier custom cake crystal champagne towers featuring bottles that cost thousands of dollars each. Rare white orchids flown in from overseas to drape across every table, and a private 20-minute fireworks display scheduled over the water. The total cost at the bottom of the page was absolutely staggering. I continued to scroll down to the billing and authorization section. My eyes narrowed and my jaw tightened when I looked at the primary guarantor line. There, written in perfectly forged ink, was my own signature. My parents had illegally put my name down to guarantee the entire balance of a wedding they had just explicitly forbidden me from attending. I picked up my cell phone and dialed David. He is my chief operating officer and my most trusted confidant in the corporate world. He answered on the very first ring. I told him to immediately pull up the master contract for the event currently taking place at the Vanguard estate. I instructed him to flag the entire file for an immediate and rigorous financial review. David pulled up the file on his end and quickly saw the immense total. He asked if we needed to dispatch our legal team to the venue right now, halt the setup, and cancel the event before any more resources were utilized. I told him absolutely not. I wanted my family to experience every single luxurious detail they had demanded. I wanted them to sip the expensive champagne, eat the imported food, and dance under the elaborate fireworks display. I wanted them to fully immerse themselves in the illusion of their high society status. But I also gave David incredibly strict instructions. I told him that the very second the weekend concluded and the final guest departed, he was to enforce our most aggressive corporate collection policies. David sounded slightly confused. He knew this was my sister's wedding, and he knew my parents were the ones hosting it. I took a deep breath and explained the harsh reality of my situation to him. I told him how I had built Apex Hospitality Group entirely from nothing over the last 10 years. I reminded him of the early days when we first met. Back then, I was working 80-hour weeks taking on freelance graphic design jobs just to keep the lights on and living in a tiny apartment where the heating barely functioned. I built this multi-million-dollar empire with my own hands, my own sweat, and my own relentless determination. I never received a single dollar of support from my family. Meanwhile, my parents had systematically drained their entire life savings and their retirement accounts to continuously fund Ashley's frivolous lifestyle. They had paid for her extensive European backpacking trips, purchased her luxury vehicles, and maintained her designer wardrobe, while I was literally struggling to afford basic groceries. The most painful betrayal happened 5 years ago when I was a junior in college. My parents had completely emptied the tuition fund that my grandparents had set up for me. They took the money I needed for my education and used it to pay for Ashley's elective cosmetic surgeries. They forced me to drop out of university and face the real world with absolutely nothing. They labeled me a failure and a dropout, completely ignoring the fact that they were the architects of my financial ruin. Now they were throwing an outrageously expensive wedding they could not possibly afford, desperately trying to impress a family of wealthy real estate developers, all while standing on a property that I owned. I told David to let the event proceed seamlessly. I wanted the venue staff to provide flawless 5-star service without a single exception. But come Monday morning, the final invoice was to be finalized and fully prepared for collection. There would be no grace period. There would be no family discounts. David agreed immediately and initiated the internal protocol on our servers. I closed my laptop and let out a long, slow exhale. My driver navigated through the heavy storm and brought me safely to the private airfield where my jet was waiting. I boarded the aircraft and settled into my seat for the short flight back to New York City. The flight was incredibly quiet and smooth. I drank a glass of sparkling water and watched the city lights emerge through the thick gray clouds. I felt a profound sense of calm wash over me. I was no longer the scared, vulnerable girl they had thrown out of the house. I was a powerhouse, and they were walking right into my trap. My car brought me from the airport directly to my penthouse overlooking the Manhattan skyline. I stepped out of the private elevator and into my home. The space was completely silent and perfectly ordered. It was a stark contrast to the chaotic, stressful wedding preparations happening back at the estate. I took off my damp coat, poured myself a large glass of vintage red wine, and stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows. I watched the endless stream of traffic moving far below on the city streets. I spent the entire weekend completely focused on my business. I refused to let thoughts of my family consume my time. I reviewed extensive acquisition reports for 3 new commercial properties in California. I held video conferences with my marketing team to approve new campaigns for our upcoming winter resorts. I did not check my social media accounts even once. I did not look at any photos of Ashley posing in her expensive white gown. I did not read any updates from my extended relatives. I simply waited. I knew exactly how my parents operated. They lived entirely on credit and false promises. They had forged my signature because their own credit scores were completely ruined. They assumed I would be too intimidated by family pressure to contest the charges. They thought I would quietly absorb the massive debt to avoid a public scandal. They had grossly underestimated the woman I had become. The weekend passed and Monday came and went with productive efficiency. Our finance department finalized the wedding invoice and flagged the fraudulent signature. We processed the paperwork precisely as I had instructed. Tuesday morning arrived with bright, brilliant sunshine pouring into my corner office at the Apex Hospitality Group headquarters. I was sitting at my large mahogany desk, meticulously reviewing the quarter-end financial reports. My schedule for the day was heavily packed with crucial investor meetings and executive board reviews. The office was buzzing with the usual high-level corporate energy. I was finalizing a real estate contract when my private cell phone began to ring. It vibrated loudly against the polished wood of my desk. Only a very select, highly vetted group of people possessed this specific phone number. I stopped typing and glanced down at the bright caller identification screen. It was my mother, Patricia. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair and watched the phone ring. I let it ring once. I let it ring twice. I let it ring 3 times, allowing the tension to build on her end of the line. Finally, I calmly reached out and picked up the device, pressing it to my ear. I did not say hello. I simply waited. There was no polite greeting from Patricia. There was no checking to see if I had made it home safely through the terrible storm on Saturday. There was no apology for treating me like a criminal at the door of the venue. Patricia sounded completely frantic, her breath catching in her throat as she yelled into the receiver. "The final venue bill is $45,000. Her voice was shrill and cracking with absolute panic. "The caterers are threatening to send us to collections immediately. How will you pay for this?" I sat perfectly still in my quiet office staring out at the expansive New York skyline. The trap had sprung exactly as I had designed it. I took a slow, measured breath, preparing to deliver the response that would systematically dismantle the false reality my family had lived in for years. "Why would I pay for a wedding that I was explicitly banned from attending?" I asked, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "We put you down as the primary guarantor," Patricia screamed back, the desperation making her vicious. "You owe us for raising you. Since you do not have a real career, your credit score is the only thing useful about you. Pay it right now or your credit is completely ruined." I laughed. It was a genuinely cold, amused sound that echoed in my spacious office. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the mahogany desk, ready to drop the truth that would change her life forever. "I am not paying a single dime, Mom, but I highly suggest you open your email right now. Look for an attachment named Ownership Deed. I do not just work with the venue, I own the entire company, and I already flagged your forged contract for corporate fraud." The line went dead silent. I could practically hear the air leaving her lungs. Just as I lowered the phone from my ear, the heavy double doors of my executive office burst violently open. My father, Richard, stormed past my startled receptionist, his face purple with rage, holding a thick manila folder in his shaking hands. He marched directly toward my desk, fully prepared to destroy me. The heavy double doors of my executive office burst violently open. My father, Richard, stormed past my startled receptionist. His face was a deep purple with unhinged rage. He held a thick manila folder in his shaking hands, marching directly toward my desk, fully prepared to destroy me. He slammed the folder down onto the pristine surface of my mahogany desk, with enough force to rattle my coffee cup. He leaned over the wood, his eyes wide and manic, screaming that I would drop the fraud charges against my mother immediately. He told me I was an ungrateful daughter and a vicious monster. He tapped his thick fingers against the cheap folder and declared that he held the absolute key to my destruction. He claimed that 5 years ago I stole $50,000 from his logistics business. He loudly insisted that this stolen money was the secret seed funding I used to launch Vanguard Hospitality. He threatened to call the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and every major business publication in the city to expose me as a common thief. If I pressed charges against Patricia for the forged venue contract, he would ruin my elite corporate reputation forever. I did not flinch. I did not stand up or raise my voice. I remained perfectly still in my leather chair, looking at the manila folder and then up at his flushed, sweating face. I told him his threats were severely outdated. I reached down and pulled open the bottom drawer of my desk. I retrieved a professionally bound 400-page document and dropped it onto the desk right next to his flimsy folder. The heavy thud echoed through the large, quiet office. I explained exactly what the bound document contained. 3 years ago, I hired one of the most ruthless forensic accounting firms in New York City. I paid them to run a complete, unrestricted audit of his logistics company, covering the exact time period I worked there as an unpaid intern. I told him the audit detailed precisely where that $50,000 went. It traced every single wire transfer and offshore routing number directly to his private illegal gambling accounts. I explained how he had embezzled money from his own business partners to pay off his massive betting debts, and then deliberately falsified the company ledger to frame his own daughter to cover his tracks. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that if he even thought about breathing a single word to the press, I would personally hand this entire audit directly to the Internal Revenue Service and the FBI. The color instantly drained from Richard's face. He stumbled backward, his mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish. The absolute power he thought he held over me simply vaporized in the span of 30 seconds. He realized he had walked blindly into a devastating trap. His blackmail was completely neutralized, and the power dynamic in the room shifted so violently he could barely stand. Before he could attempt to formulate a retreat, the office doors flew open once again. Ashley burst into the room, completely shattering the tense silence. She was no longer the pristine, glowing bride from Saturday. Her hair was a tangled, greasy mess. Her expensive makeup was completely smeared down her cheeks, leaving dark tracks of mascara. She was wearing wrinkled sweatpants and a stained designer hoodie. She ran right past me, completely ignoring my existence, and grabbed our father by the arm. She was sobbing hysterically, gasping for air as she screamed that her life was entirely ruined. She wailed that her new husband Spencer had suddenly frozen all of her bank accounts that morning. Spencer had found the urgent emails from my venue collections department. He saw the aggressive demand for the $45,000 debt. Ashley cried that Spencer thought our family was incredibly wealthy. He genuinely believed she was a trust fund heiress with unlimited resources. Now, Spencer was threatening to file for an immediate legal annulment. He had called her a grifter and screamed that our entire family was a massive fraud. Ashley begged Richard to write a check immediately. She demanded he pay the venue right now so she could save her fake high society marriage. I leaned back in my chair and let out a cold, amused laugh. I looked at my sister, watching her perfect fairy tale crumble into absolute dust. I told her that writing a check would not save her marriage. I opened my top desk drawer and pulled out a single crisp sheet of paper. I slid it across the smooth wood surface toward her. It was a comprehensive private security background check on Spencer. I explained that my corporate security team runs incredibly thorough investigations on anyone attempting to marry into a family that rents my premium properties. I read the verified facts aloud to her. Spencer was not a millionaire real estate developer. He did not own a single piece of property anywhere in the world. He was currently drowning in over $300,000 of high-interest debt from completely failed cryptocurrency investments. He had targeted Ashley because she projected the false image of massive generational wealth. He married her with the absolute certainty that our parents would cheerfully pay off his crushing financial loans. They had spent their entire relationship running a desperate con on each other. Ashley stopped crying immediately. She picked up the background check with trembling hands. Her eyes darted back and forth across the page as she read the brutal financial summaries and the pending bankruptcy filings. The reality of her sham marriage hit her with the force of a freight train. She dropped the paper onto the desk and covered her face in absolute horror. Her perfect image, the exact image my parents had sacrificed my future to build, was entirely shattered. Richard snapped. He was furious that his golden daughter's marriage was a complete sham and terrified that his own financial crimes were sitting on my desk. His pride took over his logic. He glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. He snarled that I might have won the boardroom battle, but he would permanently destroy my social standing. He told me he knew all about the massive charity gala I was hosting that very night. He promised to crash the event. He threatened to bring tabloid reporters and scream to every elite investor in the city that I was a cold, manipulative fraud who deliberately abandoned her family and left them homeless. He grabbed Ashley by the arm and dragged her sobbing out of my office, slamming the heavy doors behind them. I was left alone in the quiet of my office. I did not panic. I picked up my desk phone and pressed the speed dial for my head of corporate security. I gave him extremely specific, unwavering instructions for the gala. I told him under no circumstances was he to block my parents or my sister at the door. When they arrived with the press, he was to open the grand doors wide. He was to escort them directly down the center aisle and seat them in the very front row. I wanted them to have a perfect front row seat to their own public demise. Next, I called my legal team. I instructed them to finalize all the fraud documentation regarding the venue contract and the forged signature. I told them to have the official police reports fully processed, printed, and ready for public display on the main projection screens. I spent the next few hours working through my regular business strategy, completely unfazed by their pathetic threats. As I reviewed the evening guest list, I reflected on the grueling years I spent building this network. I remembered the countless corporate events where my parents deliberately tried to sabotage my connections. They used to spread vicious rumors about my reliability just to elevate Ashley's social standing. They actively tried to starve my business of oxygen so I would be forced to return home and live under their oppressive control. But I thrived in that pressure. Every single insult they hurled at me just fueled my fierce ambition. I built Vanguard Hospitality by being smarter, faster, and much more ruthless than anyone else in the room. Tonight, I would use those exact skills against them to finish this once and for all. The sun began to set over Manhattan, casting long shadows across the city. I left my office and walked into the private executive dressing room attached to my suite. I changed out of my tailored business suit and slipped into a breathtaking custom-designed emerald gown. The heavy silk fabric hugged my frame perfectly. I clasped a simple, elegant diamond necklace around my throat. I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror. I looked powerful, poised, and utterly untouchable. I armed myself with a sleek leather portfolio containing every undeniable piece of legal proof I needed. My private driver took me to the grand ballroom of my flagship hotel. The room was absolutely dazzling. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over hundreds of the city's most powerful investors, local politicians, and influential media executives. The clinking of expensive champagne glasses and the low murmur of high society networking filled the air. I walked through the vibrant crowd, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries with industry titans, moving steadily toward the main stage. The atmosphere was electric, with anticipation for the charity auction. The event coordinator gave me a subtle nod, signaling that it was time for my keynote speech. I walked up the short, velvet-covered steps and stood behind the crystal podium. Bright flashbulbs went off in the audience as reporters captured the moment. I tapped the microphone, preparing to welcome my prestigious guests. Right at that exact second, the massive oak doors at the back of the ballroom banged open with a deafening crash. The entire room went dead silent. Patricia, Richard, and Ashley marched aggressively down the center aisle, dragging two sleazy tabloid reporters right alongside them, with cameras already rolling. He slammed both of his hands down onto the polished surface of my mahogany desk with enough force to rattle my coffee cup. The thick manila folder he carried slapped against the wood, like a gunshot echoing through the vast silence of my executive suite. He leaned heavily over the desk, his face inches from mine, his breath coming in ragged, angry gasps. A vein throbbed visibly at his temple. He looked like a man who was completely accustomed to getting his way through pure intimidation and brute force. For my entire life, that exact expression had been the ultimate warning sign to back down and apologize. He expected me to cower. He expected me to immediately dial my legal team and beg them to drop the felony fraud charges against Patricia. Instead, I remained perfectly still in my ergonomic leather chair, my hands folded calmly in my lap, watching him sweat under the bright recessed lighting of the penthouse office. "Drop the charges right now, Melanie," he ordered, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Call your lawyers and tell them it was a massive misunderstanding. Tell them Patricia had your explicit authorization to sign that contract for the venue. If you do not make that call within the next 60 seconds, I promise you I will completely ruin this little empire you think you have built." He tapped his thick index finger aggressively against the cheap manila folder sitting between us. He declared with absolute unwavering arrogance that he held the key to my total destruction right there in his hands. I tilted my head slightly, maintaining direct eye contact. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not reach for my phone. I simply asked him what exactly he thought he had in that folder that could possibly threaten me. My total lack of panic seemed to infuriate him even further. His face turned an even deeper shade of purple, and he stood up straight, puffing out his chest to tower over my desk. "You think you are so smart?" he sneered, pointing a finger directly at my face. "You think nobody knows how you actually funded Vanguard Hospitality. You want to play hardball with your own mother over $45,000. Let us talk about $50,000, Melanie. Let us talk about the $50,000 you stole from my logistics business 5 years ago to fund your precious startup." He launched into a completely fabricated, highly detailed narrative, pacing back and forth in front of my desk, like a lawyer delivering a closing argument to a jury. He claimed that during the summer I worked as an unpaid intern at his logistics firm. I had secretly siphoned $50,000 from his primary operating accounts. He spun a ridiculous story about how he had caught the discrepancy, confronted me privately, and mercifully allowed me to quietly pack my things and leave, rather than calling the police and having his own daughter arrested for grand larceny. He claimed that stolen money was the secret seed funding that launched my entire luxury property network. He said I owed my entire existence to his money and his supposed mercy. I have the altered ledgers right here in this folder, he threatened, slapping his hand against the manila envelope again. I have the bank statements showing the missing funds during the exact weeks you had access to the financial software. I will call the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and the New York Times today. I will hand-deliver this folder to every major business reporter in Manhattan. I will tell them that the brilliant self-made CEO of Apex Hospitality Group is nothing but a common thief who robbed her own family to get ahead. Your elite reputation will be completely destroyed. Your investors will pull their funding immediately. Your board of directors will force you out before the end of the week. You will lose everything, Melanie. Unless you pick up that phone right now and drop the fraud charges against your mother. He stopped pacing and stood in front of my desk, crossing his arms over his chest. A smug, victorious smile spread across his face. He truly believed he had me backed into an inescapable corner. He believed that the scared, desperate college dropout he had kicked out of his house 5 years ago was still trapped inside me, ready to surrender the moment he applied pressure. He waited for me to break. He waited for the tears. I let a long, heavy silence stretch between us. The only sound in the office was the faint hum of the city traffic far below my penthouse windows. I slowly unclasped my hands and reached down to the bottom drawer of my desk. I pulled the heavy drawer open. The smooth glide of the metal track sounded incredibly loud in the quiet room. I reached inside and retrieved a professionally bound 400-page document. I lifted it with both hands and dropped it onto the desk right next to his flimsy folder. The heavy thud made him jump slightly. I kept my voice completely level and icy cold. You mean the $50,000 you embezzled to pay off your illegal gambling debts, then tried to frame me for when I was your unpaid intern? I asked quietly. The smug smile vanished from his face instantly. He stared at the thick black binding of the document on my desk, as if it were a live explosive. I did not stop. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the desk, forcing him to meet my gaze. Did you really think I walked away from your logistics firm and just forgot about the fact that you tried to frame your own daughter for your financial crimes? Did you honestly believe I was that stupid? You thought you could use my status as an unpaid, vulnerable intern to mask your own pathetic failures. You thought I would just run away and cry. But you forgot one crucial detail about me, Richard. I pay attention. 3 years ago, the moment Vanguard Hospitality became profitable enough to justify the expense, the very first thing I did was hire the most ruthless, aggressive forensic accounting firm in New York City. I paid them an exorbitant amount of money to run a complete, unrestricted audit of your entire logistics company covering the exact time period I worked there. I gave them full authorization to dig into every hidden ledger and shadow account you thought you had successfully buried. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the cover of the bound document. The sharp clicking sound made him flinch. The full audit is right here, Richard. It is a masterpiece of financial investigation. They traced every single missing dollar. They found the specific wire transfers you initiated in the middle of the night. They uncovered the offshore routing numbers you used to funnel the cash out of the corporate accounts. They matched the exact dates you moved the company funds directly to your private illegal betting accounts. They documented how you systematically embezzled money from your own business partners to cover your massive sports betting losses, and then deliberately falsified the employee access logs to make it look like I was the one manipulating the system. They even found the emails where you instructed your IT guy to alter the timestamps on my login credentials. You left a massive digital paper trail, and my accountants followed it all the way to your front door. I watched his bravado evaporate entirely. His shoulders slumped and the aggressive posture he had walked in with completely collapsed. His breathing became shallow and rapid. I picked up his cheap manila folder and casually tossed it into the trash can beside my desk. "You do not hold any leverage over me," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute authority. "You never have. I have kept this audit locked in my desk for 3 years, waiting for the day you or Patricia tried to cross me again. And now you have marched into my office and threatened to go to the press with a fabricated story, so let me make my counter-offer very clear. If you breathe a single word of your ridiculous lies to any reporter, if you attempt to contact my investors, or if you ever try to threaten my company again, I will not just call the police. I will personally hand-deliver this 400-page forensic audit directly to the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They will freeze your assets, seize your company, and you will spend the next 10 years in federal prison for embezzlement and corporate fraud." Richard turned entirely pale. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and gray. He stumbled backward away from my desk, his mouth opening and closing silently. He could not formulate a single word. The total absolute power he thought he held over me had simply vaporized in the span of a few minutes. He realized with terrifying clarity that he had walked blindly into a devastating trap. His blackmail was completely neutralized. The power dynamic in the room shifted so violently that he looked physically ill. The arrogant patriarch who loved to belittle my accomplishments was gone, replaced by a terrified man staring at the concrete evidence of his own destruction. He backed away toward the door, his hands trembling at his sides. He knew I had him perfectly cornered. If he tried to save my mother from the venue fraud charges, he would inevitably expose himself to massive federal embezzlement charges. He had to choose between his wife facing a lawsuit or himself going to federal prison. I watched the realization wash over his face, enjoying every single second of his absolute defeat. He was completely trapped, and he knew I would not hesitate to pull the trigger if he pushed me even 1 inch further. For years, he had used his financial power to bully and control me. He had used money to make me feel small and insignificant. Now his own financial corruption was the exact weapon I was using to bring him to his knees. He had nothing left to say. His entire identity as a successful, wealthy businessman had just been exposed as a total fraud. The silence in the office was thick and heavy, suffocating him. He opened his mouth to try and negotiate, to try and beg for some kind of family mercy, but he could not find the words. The ultimate irony was not lost on me. The man who had just demanded I pay $45,000 to protect my sister's fake aesthetic was now staring at a document that proved he was nothing but a common criminal hiding behind a tailored suit. I sat back in my chair and crossed my arms, waiting for him to either surrender completely or run out of the room. The standoff was absolute. I had completely dismantled the toxic hierarchy of our family in one single calculated move. He had no weapons left to fire. Before Richard could retreat, the heavy double doors of my office flew open once again. Ashley burst into the room, sobbing hysterically, gasping for air, as tears streamed down her face, completely unaware of the devastating standoff that had just occurred between her father and her sister. Ashley did not even glance in my direction. To her, I was completely invisible, just as I had been for the majority of our lives. She threw herself toward Richard, clutching the lapels of his wrinkled suit jacket with manic desperation. Her breath came in sharp, jagged gasps echoing off the high ceiling of my executive suite. She screamed that her entire life was over, her voice cracking with a pitch of hysteria that forced Richard to physically take a step backward. She shook him violently, demanding to know what he had done. "Spencer locked me out," she shrieked, her voice bouncing off the glass walls of my office. "He froze all of our joint checking accounts this morning. He canceled the platinum credit cards he gave me for the honeymoon. He changed the passcodes to the penthouse suite." Richard tried to shush her, glancing nervously at me, fully aware that his other daughter held his absolute destruction in a bound audit on her desk. But Ashley was entirely oblivious to the tension in the room. She was drowning in her own catastrophic reality. "He found out about the $45,000 venue bill," she wailed, tears carving deep tracks through her ruined makeup. "He saw the aggressive collection emails. He found out you forged the contract. He thought we were rich, Dad. He thought we had generational wealth. He is filing for an immediate annulment. He called his lawyers this morning and told them we are nothing but a family of pathetic grifters. The word grifters hung in the air, sharp and accurate. Richard looked as though he might physically be sick right there on my Persian rug. He knew the truth better than anyone. They were grifters surviving on credit lies and the stolen funds of their eldest daughter. "You have to fix this right now," Ashley demanded, stomping her foot on the floor like a petulant child, throwing a tantrum over a broken toy. "You need to pull out your checkbook and pay the venue immediately. You have to call Spencer and tell him this was all a massive misunderstanding. Tell him your accounting department made an administrative error. Tell him the $45,000 is pocket change to you. Do it now or I will lose my husband." She shook him again, oblivious to the fact that Richard's checking accounts were completely empty and his logistics firm was entirely built on embezzled gambling money. He could not write a check for $45, let alone $45,000. He stood there, paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. He looked completely broken, stripped of the arrogant facade he had worn when he kicked me out of the Hamptons estate just days prior. I sat behind my mahogany desk, steepled my fingers, and watched the magnificent implosion of their carefully curated lies. It was a masterpiece of their own making. I let her scream for another full minute, letting the absolute desperation of her situation fill the room. Then I slowly pushed my chair back. The leather creaked loudly, cutting through her hysterical sobbing. Ashley finally turned her head and looked at me. For a split second, confusion washed over her face, as if she could not comprehend how the sister she had banned from her high society wedding was currently sitting behind the desk of a premier New York corporate suite. "Writing a check is not going to save your fake marriage, Ashley," I said, my voice completely calm and level. She glared at me, her sadness instantly transforming into vicious entitlement. "Shut up, Melanie. Nobody is talking to you. You have no idea what is going on. This is about high society money, something a college dropout could never possibly understand." I smiled. It was a cold, sharp smile that made her take a sudden step back. I reached into the top drawer of my desk. I bypassed the forensic audit that had just destroyed our father and pulled out a single crisp manila folder. I placed it gently on the polished wood surface and slid it straight across the desk toward her. "Actually, I understand high society money perfectly," I replied. "That is why my corporate security team runs comprehensive mandatory financial background checks on any high-profile individual attempting to marry into a family that rents my premium properties. When you submitted the fraudulent contract using my name, my team automatically ran a full diagnostic on your new husband." Ashley stared at the folder but refused to touch it. "What are you talking about?" I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. "Your husband is not a millionaire real estate developer, Ashley. He does not own a single piece of property anywhere in the world. He does not have a trust fund. He does not have generational wealth. He does not even have a standard savings account." "That is a lie," she screamed, taking a step toward the desk. "He drives a custom-imported sports car. He wears designer watches. He took me to exclusive restaurants every single night. He leased the car on high-interest credit," I corrected her smoothly. "He bought the watches on payment plans he has already defaulted on. Spencer is completely broke. In fact, he is less than broke. He is drowning in over $300,000 of catastrophic debt from failed cryptocurrency investments and illegal margin trading. He is currently facing 2 separate civil lawsuits for loan defaults." Ashley stopped breathing. She looked at Richard for confirmation, but Richard was staring at the floor, absolutely terrified by the depth of information I possessed. He was slowly realizing that I controlled every single variable in this room. "Spencer targeted you because you project the exact same fake image of extreme wealth that he does," I explained, driving the final nail into the coffin of her fairy tale. "He saw you spending our parents' money on designer clothes and luxury vacations. He assumed Mom and Dad were incredibly rich. He married you because he was absolutely certain your family would cheerfully pay off his crushing financial loans the second you tied the knot. The reason he is furious about the $45,000 venue bill is not because he hates grifters. It is because he just realized you are as utterly broke as he is. He is filing for an annulment because you cannot bail him out of his own financial ruin. The air in the office went completely dead. Ashley slowly reached out with trembling fingers and opened the folder. She flipped through the first few pages of the verified security report. Her eyes scanned the brutal financial summaries, the pending bankruptcy filings, and the detailed list of his defaulted loans. She saw the photographs of his supposed luxury properties, which were actually just short-term rental agreements that had been flagged for non-payment. The color drained from her face. The flawless, arrogant golden child who had sneered at me from the foyer of the Vanguard estate was completely gone. She dropped the papers back onto the desk as if they were physically burning her hands. She stumbled backward, her legs giving out slightly until she hit the edge of the leather guest chair. She sank into it, covering her face with her hands, completely silent. Her perfect image, the exact image my parents had sacrificed my entire future to build, was entirely shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. They had spent their entire relationship running a desperate, pathetic con on each other, and the house of cards had just collapsed. Richard watched his golden daughter fall apart. The reality of his complete failure crashed down on him. His logistics company was a fraud, his finances were destroyed, his daughter's marriage was a sham, and the child he had discarded and labeled a failure was the one holding the executioner's switch. But instead of showing an ounce of humility, his pride violently rejected the reality of the situation. His fear rapidly mutated back into pure, unadulterated hatred. He could not accept that I had bested him. He glared at me, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. He marched right back up to my desk, leaning over the scattered background check and the forensic audit. "You think you have won?" He snarled, his voice a guttural hiss. "You think you can just sit up here in your ivory tower and destroy your own flesh and blood? You think a few pieces of paper give you the right to ruin our lives?" "You ruined your own lives," I stated simply. "I just handed you the receipt." Richard slammed his fist against the mahogany wood. "We know exactly what you are doing tonight, Melanie. We read the society pages. We know you are hosting that massive charity gala at the Grand Plaza. We know the mayor is going to be there. We know every elite angel investor and venture capitalist in the city is attending." I raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to play his final desperate card. "You care about your elite corporate reputation so much?" He threatened, a wild, manic look returning to his eyes. "You care about looking like a brilliant, self-made leader. Well, we are going to show up to your precious gala tonight. We are going to bring the tabloid reporters I have on speed dial. We will march right into that ballroom, and we will scream to every single investor in this city that you are a complete fraud. We will tell them you abandoned your own family. We will tell them you left your parents homeless and deliberately ruined your sister's wedding out of pure, petty jealousy. We will drag your name through the mud until your stock plummets and your board fires you." He grabbed Ashley by the arm, roughly yanking her up from the guest chair. She stumbled, still crying silently, clutching her ruined designer hoodie. "We will see you tonight." "Melanie," Richard spat, his face twisted in an ugly sneer. "Be prepared to lose everything." He dragged my sister out of my office, their hurried footsteps echoing down the corridor before the heavy double doors slammed shut behind them. The heavy double doors of my office slammed shut with a finality that rattled the glass walls of the suite. The sharp sound echoed through the massive space, followed quickly by the fading, frantic clicks of my sister's heels, and my father's heavy, furious footfalls retreating down the marble corridor. I remained perfectly still in my leather chair. I listened as the elevator dinged in the distance, swallowing them whole and carrying them away. I did not panic. I simply took a slow, deep breath, inhaling the crisp, air-conditioned atmosphere of the empire I had built entirely from scratch. I leaned forward and picked up the secured landline on my desk, pressing the direct extension for Marcus, my head of corporate security. He answered on the first ring, his voice sharp and professional. I told him we had a slight change of protocol for the annual Vanguard Charity Gala taking place at the Grand Plaza tonight. Marcus was accustomed to managing the highest level of threat assessment for billionaires, but my next instructions made him pause. I told him that Richard, Patricia, and Ashley were going to attempt to crash the event. I told him they would be angry loud and accompanied by at least two uncredentialed tabloid reporters looking for a scandal. Marcus assured me that his team would lock down the perimeter and have them physically removed from the property before they even reached the lobby. I told him absolutely not. I explicitly instructed Marcus to order his entire detail to stand down. When my family arrived, his men were to open the grand mahogany doors of the ballroom wide. They were to greet them politely, bypass the guest list check, and escort them directly down the center aisle of the event. I wanted Marcus to reserve a completely unobstructed front row table specifically for them. I wanted them seated comfortably under the brightest lights in the room so they could have a flawless front row view to their own spectacular demise. Marcus agreed without hesitation, confirming the new directive. I ended the call with Marcus and immediately dialed my lead corporate attorney, Jessica. She was already at the Grand Plaza overseeing the preliminary setup. I asked her to confirm that the multimedia files I had sent her earlier were loaded and queued on the primary projection system. She confirmed that the high-resolution scans of the forged venue contract the falsified signature the police reports and the certified forensic audit were completely ready to be broadcast across the massive screens behind the podium. I thanked her and hung up, feeling a profound sense of closure locking into place. I turned back to my computer monitor and opened the finalized digital guest list for the evening. The list was a staggering collection of international venture capitalists, real estate tycoons, state senators, and media moguls. I knew every single one of them personally. As my eyes tracked over the names of two specific tech investors, a bitter memory surfaced, sharp and vivid. I remembered a winter networking summit 5 years ago, right when I was desperately trying to secure my initial seed funding. But my parents had somehow discovered my schedule. They showed up at the summit uninvited, dressed in designer clothes paid for by Richard's embezzled funds. While I was fetching a prototype portfolio from the coat check, Patricia and Richard completely cornered my potential investors. They spent 30 minutes pitching Ashley's completely doomed superficial fashion line while loudly casually mentioning that I was highly unstable and terrible with money. They actively poisoned the well, making sure my funding was denied so they could redirect the capital toward their golden child. They had spent my entire adult life running interference on my success. I remembered another instance when Richard intercepted a physical letter of intent from a prominent banking firm, hiding it in his desk for weeks so the offer would expire. He wanted me dependent, broke, and easily controlled. They wanted to starve my business of oxygen so I would be forced to return to their house and live under their oppressive critical rule. But every single time they threw up a roadblock, I climbed directly over it. Their constant vicious sabotage did not break me. It forged me into an absolute weapon. I learned to move in silence to secure my assets through impenetrable legal trusts, and to build a network of allies who valued actual results over high society pedigree. I closed the guest list on my monitor and powered down my workstation. It was time to leave the office. I walked to my private dressing room. The dressing room was dimly lit. I unbuttoned my tailored daytime business suit, letting the structured fabric fall away. I stepped into a breathtaking custom-designed emerald green silk gown. It hugged my frame perfectly, the deep green color making my eyes look sharp and predatory. I sat down at the vanity and applied a bold dark red lipstick, tying my hair back into an immaculate severe twist that allowed no stray strands. I opened a velvet jewelry box and clasped a simple, elegant diamond necklace around my throat. The stones caught the low light, throwing sharp refractions across the mirror. I did not just look like a successful CEO. I looked like a woman who owned the entire city. I looked utterly untouchable. I turned away from the mirror and picked up a sleek black leather portfolio from the side table. Inside the portfolio were the physical certified copies of the undeniable legal proof I needed. I had the original venue contract bearing the clumsily forged signature. I had the verified police report detailing the exact nature of the fraud. I had the summary pages of Richard's devastating financial audit. I tucked the portfolio firmly under my arm, grabbed my evening clutch, and walked out of the suite, my heels clicking a steady, commanding rhythm against the marble floors. My private security detail was waiting for me in the underground parking garage. My driver held the door to the armored town car open, and I slid into the plush leather interior. We pulled out into the chaotic, vibrant energy of the Manhattan evening. Inside the car, my mind was a fortress of absolute calm. I reviewed my opening remarks in my head, calculating the exact timing, the precise tone, and the specific pauses I would use to maximize the impact of the impending confrontation. I knew Richard and Patricia operated purely on ego and emotion. They were wildly unpredictable when cornered, but their arrogance always made them perform for a crowd. They fundamentally believed that public pressure would force me to surrender. They were about to discover that I was the one who controlled the stage. The town car glided smoothly up to the grand entrance of the Grand Plaza Hotel. I stepped out of the car into the cool night air. Flashbulbs instantly erupted from the designated press corral set up behind velvet ropes. I offered a tight practice smile to the cameras and walked past them, flanked by two towering security guards who guided me through the massive gilded front doors. The atmosphere inside the grand ballroom was absolutely intoxicating. The space was a masterpiece of architectural opulence. Three massive crystal chandeliers hung from the intricately painted ceiling, casting a warm, shimmering glow over the crowd. Hundreds of the city's most powerful, influential figures stood mingling in tight groups. It was a flawless display of wealth, power, and influence, all gathered together under my specific invitation. I moved through the vibrant crowd with measured, deliberate steps. I shook hands with a senator from Albany, exchanged a brief, polite greeting with a media mogul, and smiled at the venture capitalist my parents had once tried to turn against me. I reached the front of the room near the large, elevated main stage. The event coordinator, a highly efficient woman holding a glowing tablet, caught my eye. She gave me a subtle, sharp nod, signaling that the guests were seated and it was time for my keynote speech. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the electric anticipation of the room wash over me. I walked up the short, velvet-covered steps to the main stage. The ambient noise in the ballroom began to naturally fade as the guests realized the program was starting. I stepped behind the clear crystal podium, placing my black leather portfolio carefully on the shelf just out of sight. I looked out over the sea of faces, noting the empty front row table my security team had deliberately reserved. Bright flashbulbs went off in the audience as the official event photographers captured the moment. The massive projection screens behind me displayed the elegant Vanguard Hospitality logo in gold lettering. I reached out and tapped the microphone lightly with my index finger. The sharp, resonant sound echoed perfectly through the high-end acoustic system, commanding absolute silence from the remaining chatter. I opened my mouth to deliver my welcoming address. Right at that exact second, the massive, heavy oak doors at the very back of the ballroom banged open with a deafening, violent crash. The wooden doors hit the brass stoppers so hard, the sound reverberated like an explosion. The entire room went completely dead silent. Every single head in the ballroom whipped around to look at the entrance. Patricia, Richard, and Ashley marched aggressively through the doorway, their faces twisted in ugly, unhinged rage. They stormed straight down the center aisle of the elegant ballroom, physically dragging two sleazy, disheveled tabloid reporters right alongside them, their cameras already raised and rolling. The sudden violent intrusion shattered the elegant ambiance of the charity gala. Gasps rippled through the sea of seated guests as Patricia stormed forward, her face twisted into a mask of theatrical agony. She shoved past a startled waiter, sending a silver tray of champagne flutes crashing to the floor, but she did not even glance back. Her eyes were locked solely onto me standing at the podium. Instead of marching all the way to the stage, she stopped abruptly halfway down the center aisle. She spotted a freestanding microphone set up for the planned audience question and answer session. She snatched it from its stand with aggressive, unhinged force. The screech of audio feedback pierced the ballroom, causing several prominent venture capitalists in the front rows to wince and cover their ears. Patricia did not care about the disruption. She leveled a trembling, manicured finger directly at me. Her voice boomed through the high-fidelity speakers, echoing harshly off the crystal chandeliers. "Look at her!" Patricia shrieked, her voice cracking with manufactured devastation. Look at the great successful CEO of Vanguard Hospitality. Look at the woman you are all applauding tonight. You sit there in your tailored suits, and you think she is a brilliant visionary. You think she built this multi-million-dollar empire through hard work and relentless dedication. I am here to tell you the ugly absolute truth. She is a monster. She is a complete and total fraud. The grand ballroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked murmurs and frantic whispers. Elite investors shifted uncomfortably in their plush seats, exchanging uneasy, calculating glances. The mayor of New York, seated at the VIP table directly in front of the stage, lowered his champagne glass, his expression hardening into serious concern. The CEO of a major tech conglomerate leaned over to his chief financial officer, whispering rapidly behind his hand. The two sleazy tabloid reporters my father had dragged in immediately pushed their way to the front of the aisle, shoving past security personnel who had been ordered to stand down. Their camera flashes were blinding as they frantically documented the unfolding scandal, sensing a career-making headline. This was exactly the kind of catastrophic public disaster that could permanently destroy a corporate brand and trigger an immediate shareholder panic. I stood perfectly still behind the crystal podium. I did not gesture for my security team to intervene. I did not try to shout over her theatrical wailing. I simply leaned my hands on the edges of the podium and watched my mother dig her own grave in front of the most powerful people in Manhattan. "She stole everything from us!" Patricia wailed into the microphone, her voice rising to a fever pitch of performative hysteria. She maliciously siphoned our family's generational wealth to fund her precious little startup. She robbed her own father blind. She drained our bank accounts, manipulated our private investments, and left us with absolutely nothing. We gave her everything a child could possibly want. We gave her a beautiful childhood, a premium education, and endless unconditional support. And how does she repay us? By illegally stealing the family fortune and standing up there claiming she built this company all by herself. Patricia paused for breath, wiping a perfectly timed, non-existent tear from her cheek. She knew exactly how to play a crowd to extract maximum sympathy. I thought back to every time she had used this exact tone to isolate me. I remembered holiday dinners where she would loudly announce my non-existent failures to extended relatives, just to make Ashley shine brighter. I remembered her secretly calling my first investors masquerading as a concerned mother, warning them that I was mentally unstable. She had always weaponized public opinion against me to keep me subservient. She had spent decades perfecting this exact performance at country club luncheons and high society dinners, twisting reality to make herself the ultimate suffering martyr. But tonight she was performing on my stage under my lights. And now Patricia continued, her voice trembling with righteous indignation. She is trying to throw us out on the street. While she stands up there in a custom designer gown wearing diamonds paid for with our stolen money, she is actively trying to leave her own parents homeless. She maliciously sabotaged her sister's wedding just days ago out of pure petty jealousy. She sent aggressive corporate collection agents to harass us during the private reception. She is a cold, calculated, ungrateful daughter who destroys anyone who gets in her way. She lacks a basic human soul. Richard stepped up beside her, his face flushed with arrogant triumph. He grabbed the microphone from his wife's hands, eager to deliver his own devastating blow to my career. "She is a thief!" he bellowed, scanning the room to ensure the major financial backers were listening intently. "She embezzled $50,000 from my logistics firm to secure her initial seed funding. She falsified the ledgers to cover her tracks. Anyone doing business with Vanguard Hospitality is doing business with a criminal. You need to pull your investments right now before she steals your money too. You are all funding a massive corporate scam." Ashley, looking disheveled and frantic in her wrinkled sweatpants, flanked them on the other side. She sobbed loudly for the cameras playing the role of the tragic bride perfectly. She dabbed at her ruined mascara intentionally, making herself look as pathetic and victimized as possible to feed the narrative. The sheer audacity of their coordinated performance was staggering. They were banking entirely on the element of shock and public embarrassment. They assumed that a public, highly emotional confrontation would paralyze me. They thought I would be so utterly terrified of a media scandal that I would immediately surrender, write them a massive check to make them go away, and hand over control of my company to preserve the peace. They had utilized this exact same toxic tactic when I was a teenager, screaming at me in front of my friends or teachers until I caved to their demands simply to end the public humiliation. But I was no longer a terrified teenager desperately seeking their approval. I was a powerhouse executive, the architect of my own life, and I possessed the absolute documented truth. I remained silent, letting the heavy, suffocating weight of their accusations hang in the air for a long minute. I let the tabloid reporters record every single defamatory word. I wanted an airtight, publicly documented video record of their slander for the impending legal fallout. Patricia took the microphone back from Richard for her grand finale. "She needs to step down immediately," Patricia demanded, her voice echoing through the massive ballroom with venomous authority. "She needs to resign her position as CEO and hand control of this entire company over to the real family, to the people who actually funded it, to the people she robbed. If she has an ounce of decency left in her soul, she will surrender her position tonight and publicly beg for our forgiveness." Patricia lowered the microphone, gripping the stand tightly. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving with the exertion of her dramatic performance. She stared up at me with a triumphant, malicious glare. She fully expected me to crumble. She expected me to burst into tears, drop my head in overwhelming shame, and flee the stage in utter disgrace. She waited for the sound of my total surrender. The entire ballroom fell dead silent. The clinking of silverware and expensive glasses ceased entirely. The hushed whispers completely stopped. 500 of the city's most influential executives held their breath, completely paralyzed by the unfolding drama, waiting for my reaction. The silence was deafening. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like physical pressure pressing down on my chest. The only sound in the cavernous space was the frantic clicking of the camera shutters as the tabloid photographers zoomed in on my face, waiting for the devastating shot of my emotional breakdown. I did not break. I did not flinch. I slowly lifted my head and looked directly at my mother. The sheer icy calm in my eyes made her triumphant smile falter for a fraction of a second. I reached out and gently tapped my microphone. The crisp, clear sound cut through the heavy silence of the ballroom like a razor blade. "I appreciate my mother bringing up family loyalty," I said, my voice echoing with absolute, unwavering authority. I did not raise my voice. I did not sound defensive, panicked, or angry. I sounded exactly like a corporate executive addressing a minor, predictable discrepancy in a quarterly earnings report. The sheer, unnerving normalcy of my tone sent a sudden ripple of profound unease through my parents. Richard shifted uncomfortably on his feet, his eyes darting quickly toward the exits, as if sensing a trap he could not yet see. I reached into the hidden pocket of my emerald gown and retrieved a small, sleek remote control. Since my family has decided to turn a charity gala into a public audit of my character and my company's finances, I continued smoothly, "It is only fair that we examine the actual verified documentation together." I pressed a single button on the remote. The massive projection screen behind me instantly switched from the elegant Vanguard Hospitality logo to a series of highly sensitive, legally certified documents. "Let us look at how loyal they are," I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy, expectant silence of the ballroom. I pressed the laser pointer in my hand, directing a brilliant green dot right onto the center of the massive projection screen. The image displayed was crystal clear, magnified to a towering 20 feet tall. It was the itemized, fully executed contract for Ashley's luxury wedding venue. The green dot traced the bottom of the page, circling the final signature line. "This is the contract where my parents forged my signature to steal $45,000, I stated, letting each word land with absolute precision. "They committed this fraud to secure a premium venue for a wedding that I was explicitly, aggressively banned from attending. They used the corporate credentials of Vanguard Hospitality, the very company they are currently standing here trying to destroy, to illegally guarantee their own extravagant unpaid debts. The collective gasp from the audience was practically a physical wave. 500 jaws dropped in unison. The elite investors, the politicians, and the media magnates who had just listened to my mother's tearful tirade now stared at the undeniably verified document looming over us. The two tabloid reporters at the front of the aisle completely abandoned their allegiance to Richard. They shoved their way right up to the edge of the stage, their cameras firing like strobe lights, frantically snapping high-resolution photographs of the forged signature on the screen. The brilliant flashes illuminated the absolute terror washing over Patricia's face. She physically recoiled, dropping the microphone to her side, as if it had suddenly caught fire. She threw her hands up, trying desperately to shield her face from the aggressive barrage of camera flashes. The arrogant, self-righteous martyr who had just commanded the room was instantly reduced to a cowering, exposed criminal. She looked wildly at the surrounding crowd, searching for the sympathy she had so expertly cultivated just moments before. But the faces staring back at her were hard, disgusted, and unforgiving. The city's elite do not tolerate messy, desperate theft, and they certainly do not tolerate being made fools of by amateur con artists. I did not give them a single second to recover. I pressed the button on my remote again. The projection screen flickered instantly, replacing the wedding contract with a stark black and white document bearing the official seal of the New York Police Department. "I am not entirely done," I told the crowd, my voice echoing evenly over the surround sound system. Right next to the fraudulent contract is the official stamped police report I filed this morning. This is not a family dispute. This is a formal criminal complaint for felony identity theft, grand larceny, and corporate fraud. My legal team has already submitted this comprehensive evidence directly to the district attorney. The authorities are currently processing the warrants. You did not storm into a charity gala to expose a corrupt CEO. You crashed my event because you are entirely bankrupt, you are drowning in illegal debt, and you are absolutely terrified that your lifetime of financial crimes has finally caught up with you. The atmosphere in the grand ballroom shifted from shocked disbelief to a chilling, judgmental freeze. The mayor leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest and shaking his head in absolute disgust. The prominent venture capitalists who had previously been cornered by my parents were now actively pulling out their phones, undoubtedly instructing their own security and legal teams to sever any remaining ties with Richard's logistics firm. My parents were watching their entire social and professional universe evaporate in real time. The high society reputation they had sacrificed my entire childhood to build was being systematically incinerated on a 20-foot screen. Patricia stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the carpeted aisle until she bumped into Ashley. My sister was frozen, staring up at the police report with her mouth hanging wide open, realizing that she was implicated in a massive, highly public felony case. The fairy tale was over. The grift was entirely exposed, but Richard simply could not accept defeat. His massive, fragile ego would not allow him to surrender in front of the very people he had spent his entire life trying to impress. He saw the wealthy investors turning away. He saw the reporters documenting their utter ruin. His face turned a dangerous, mottled shade of crimson. He reached out and violently snatched the microphone right out of Patricia's trembling hand. He stepped forward, putting himself between his wife and the stage, attempting to physically reclaim the narrative. He raised his free hand in a placating, desperate gesture toward the front rows of VIP tables. "Listen to me," Richard bellowed, his voice booming out over the speakers, rough and frantic. He completely ignored the towering police report projected behind me, choosing instead to play the only card he had left. He played the family card. "You have to listen to me," he pleaded, looking directly at the mayor and then to the lead investors. "Do not let her manipulate you. This is a private family matter that she is intentionally blowing completely out of proportion to ruin us. We are a good, respectable family. We have done business in this city for 30 years. You all know me. You know my logistics firm. This girl has always been a bitter, vindictive child who hates her sister's happiness. Families help each other. Families share resources. I am her father. I gave her life. I paid for the roof over her head for 18 years. Whatever money we used, we were completely entitled to use. A daughter is supposed to honor her parents, not drag them through the mud over a simple misunderstanding about a venue deposit. She is twisting the truth to make us look like criminals. I watched him sweat under the intense, unforgiving glare of the stage lights. His suit, which had looked so sharp when he kicked the doors open, now looked rumpled and entirely inadequate. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar. He was pacing back and forth in the center aisle, gripping the microphone so tightly, his knuckles were completely white. He was delivering the performance of his life, but he was performing to an audience that only respected leverage, data, and power. And right now, I held all three. I did not interrupt him. I simply stood behind the crystal podium, perfectly illuminated, letting his panicked, irrational rambling highlight his absolute lack of professionalism. I watched him dig his grave deeper, exposing the arrogant entitlement that had ruined our family. He pointed an accusing finger at me. "She is a liar," he shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "She fabricated that police report. She bribed the venue management to say we forged the signature. She is trying to steal my logistics company out from under me by ruining my good name. You cannot believe a single thing she says. She is a ruthless, heartless snake who would sell her own flesh and blood just to get ahead in the corporate world. We only took that money because she owed it to us. She owes us for everything we sacrificed to raise her. She owes us for every single meal she ate in our house." His voice echoed harshly off the high ceilings, but it lacked the commanding authority it once possessed. The elite crowd remained entirely unmoved by his desperate emotional appeals. A prominent female hedge fund manager seated in the second row actually scoffed out loud, turning her back on Richard to sip her champagne. The visual rejection was utterly devastating. Richard saw it happen. He saw the absolute disdain radiating from the people he considered his peers. The realization that his social currency was entirely worthless hit him with the force of a freight train. He was no longer the respected patriarch holding court at the country club. He was a desperate, sweating fraud exposed in front of the entire city. His frantic pleading rapidly began to mutate into blind, unadulterated panic. The carefully constructed mask of the wealthy, benevolent patriarch dissolved completely, revealing the cornered, vicious man underneath. He began to sweat profusely, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. He stepped closer to the stage, looking up at me with an expression of pure, unfiltered hatred. He was losing control of the room, losing control of his wife and daughter, and entirely losing his grip on reality. The power dynamic had completely inverted, and his fragile mind simply could not process the defeat. "You think you are so smart?" Richard spat into the microphone, his breathing turning ragged and uneven. "You think projecting some fake documents on a screen makes you a winner? You think these people care about you? They do not care about you, Melanie. You are nothing but a dropout who got lucky. You do not belong in this room. You do not belong in this society. We are the true Vanguard family. We are the ones who deserve to be standing on that stage. We are the ones who built this legacy, not you." He was completely unraveling. The more he screamed, the more the audience pulled away. Security personnel had begun to slowly, silently close in from the perimeter, awaiting my command, but I subtly raised one hand, keeping them at bay. I needed Richard to finish. I needed him to completely exhaust every single lie he had ever told. The reporters were practically vibrating with excitement, their recording devices thrust forward to capture every syllable of his breakdown. They were documenting the spectacular destruction of a man who believed he was entirely above the law. "You are going to regret this," Richard threatened, his voice dropping into a guttural, menacing growl that was perfectly amplified by the high-end audio system. "You are going to drop these charges right now. You are going to sign a public retraction, and you are going to pay the remaining balance for your sister's wedding. If you do not do exactly what I say, I will make sure you never work in this city again. I know people. I have connections. I will burn your precious little company straight to the ground. I will make sure you lose every single property you own." He took another step forward, his chest heaving. His panic was entirely overriding his logic. He was no longer thinking about the audience. He was no longer thinking about the reporters. He was only focused on breaking me using the same terrifying dominant tactics he had used when I was a child trapped in his house. But the acoustics of the grand ballroom were perfectly calibrated. The microphone in his hand was directly wired to the venue's main surround sound system, capturing and broadcasting every single micro-variation in his voice to every corner of the vast room. Richard pointed his finger at me one last time. "You owe us that money," he shouted, his face completely purple with rage. "You owe us everything. You think a felony charge scares me. You think I am afraid of a little corporate fraud." Richard took a sharp, gasping breath, entirely losing the last shred of his self-control. In his blind, desperate panic to prove his absolute dominance, he completely forgot the sheer power of the microphone gripped tightly in his fist. He forgot about the hundreds of powerful witnesses sitting in stunned silence. He leaned forward, aiming his voice like a weapon, and accidentally blurted out a much darker secret. "We only used your name because we needed to cover the second mortgage we took out on the house." Richard yelled, his voice booming through the high-fidelity speakers and rattling the crystal chandeliers above. The sheer volume of his desperate fury vibrated in the chests of every single person seated in the grand ballroom. His face was a mask of twisted, self-righteous anger. He gripped the microphone stand so hard it trembled, entirely oblivious to the monumental gravity of the words that had just left his mouth. "We wouldn't be in this massive mess if you just paid the damn bill like a good daughter." The entire ballroom erupted into a chaotic frenzy of shocked whispers and horrified gasps. The elite investors, the politicians, and the media magnates who had been watching the spectacle unfold were now actively leaning away from the stage in pure disgust. A second mortgage. The phrase rippled through the crowd of financial experts like a contagious disease. The two tabloid reporters at the front of the aisle completely abandoned their cameras for a split second, their jaws dropping, as they processed the absolute goldmine of a quote they had just captured on audio. They came for a simple society scandal. But Richard had just handed them a front-page financial crime on a silver platter. I stood perfectly still behind the crystal podium. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match his unhinged screaming. I looked at him with lethal, absolute calm. The silence I maintained was far more powerful than any shouting match could ever be. I let his words hang in the heavy, stagnant air of the ballroom, allowing the sheer magnitude of his public confession to settle over the audience. My parents had spent their entire lives treating people like stepping stones. Using manipulation and guilt as their primary currency was their standard operating procedure. But in a room full of people who analyzed risk and liability for a living, Richard had just declared himself a total toxic asset. The mayor of New York City slowly shook his head, leaning over to his chief of staff to undoubtedly order an immediate severance of any city contracts tied to Richard's logistics firm. The venture capitalists who had once entertained my parents at networking summits were now visibly pulling out their phones, frantically typing messages to their legal teams. They witnessed a spectacular implosion. Richard stood in the center aisle, chest heaving, a triumphant smirk trying to force its way onto his sweating face. He genuinely thought he had won. He genuinely believed that exposing his financial desperation would somehow shame me into opening my checkbook right there on the stage. "A second mortgage," I repeated, my voice echoing evenly over the surround sound system. The crisp, detached tone of my words cut through the remaining murmurs in the room, commanding immediate silence. "You took out a second mortgage on the Hamptons estate to cover the massive shortfall in your logistics firm today. You leveraged the family home because no reputable bank would ever approve a standard commercial loan given the fraudulent ledgers you have been keeping. You used my name on Ashley's wedding contract because your own credit is completely destroyed. You thought you could float the venue deposit until the second mortgage cleared." "That is exactly right." Richard spat back into the microphone, his arrogance blinding him to the trap he was willingly stepping into. "And it is your responsibility to cover it. We provided for you. We built the foundation you used to launch this ridiculous hospitality company. If you had just written the check for the venue, none of this would be happening. You brought this public humiliation on yourself." He looked around the room, desperately seeking validation from the elite crowd, completely missing the looks of sheer horror and revulsion staring back at him. He was a drowning man, demanding that the rescue boat sink itself to save him. "I appreciate your total transparency, Richard," I said, leaning slightly closer to the podium microphone. "But there is a massive fundamental flaw in your aggressive financial strategy, a flaw that you just broadcasted to 500 of the most powerful people in Manhattan, including several state prosecutors sitting in the third row." I paused, letting the silence stretch out until the tension in the room was almost unbearable. "I paid off the original mortgage on the Hamptons estate 2 years ago. I did it entirely out of goodwill, using my own personal corporate dividends to ensure you and Patricia would never face foreclosure." The color began to drain from Richard's face. His triumphant sneer faltered, replaced by a sudden dawning confusion. "I did not just pay off the balance," I continued, my voice striking hard, like a hammer. "I completely satisfied the debt. And as part of that legal transaction, which you both happily signed in a desperate bid to avoid bankruptcy, the primary title and deed of that property were transferred directly into a holding trust. A holding trust that I exclusively own and control. You do not own the Hamptons estate, Richard. You have not owned it for 24 months. You are merely a tenant, living in a property owned by Vanguard Hospitality." Richard physically staggered backward, as if he had been punched in the chest. The microphone in his hand dropped. An inch. The devastating reality of the situation was finally piercing through his thick layer of narcissistic delusion. I watched his eyes widen in pure, unadulterated terror as his brain scrambled to process the legal ramifications of what he had just done. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. "You cannot legally take out a second mortgage on a property you do not own," I stated, my voice echoing with brutal finality. "You cannot leverage an asset that does not belong to you in order to secure that second mortgage you just loudly bragged about," I explained calmly there. To the captivated audience, you would have had to falsify the property deed. You would have had to forge the ownership documents and submit fraudulent asset declarations to a federally insured financial institution. You just stood in front of local politicians, elite investors, and the press, and voluntarily confessed to committing massive bank fraud. You confessed to a federal crime on a hot-wired microphone. You did not expose me tonight, Richard. You just handed the district attorney a recorded voluntary confession." Patricia let out a sharp, genuine shriek of horror. She dropped her designer clutch, the expensive bag hitting the carpet with a dull thud. She clutched her hands to her face, her carefully curated high society image completely disintegrating. She looked wildly at Richard, her eyes wide with panic. "Tell me she is lying," Patricia demanded, her voice shrill and frantic. "Tell me you did not forge the property deed. Tell me we are not going to federal prison over a second mortgage." But Richard could not speak. His jaw worked silently up and down, completely devoid of his usual bluster. He looked like a cornered animal. Ashley, standing just behind them, looked like she might physically collapse. The golden child who had spent her entire life believing she was the heir to a massive, untouchable fortune was finally realizing that her parents were nothing but broke, desperate criminals. She looked around the glamorous ballroom, making direct eye contact with the wealthy individuals she had always tried to emulate. She saw their judgment. She saw their utter disgust. The fairy tale she had demanded, the luxury wedding she had tried to steal, was dissolving into a nightmare of impending federal indictments and total social ruin. She was ruined. The absolute destruction of their reputation was complete. I watched as the lead investor for a major tech firm stood up from his front row table. He buttoned his suit jacket, cast a look of profound pity toward my parents, and walked deliberately toward the exit. It was the ultimate signal. One by one, other prominent figures began to turn away from the spectacle in the aisle, whispering furiously to their associates. Richard reached out a trembling hand toward the departing tech investor, opening his mouth to beg, but no sound came out. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his own catastrophic mistake tonight. The blinding flashes of the cameras seemed to mock him, capturing his spectacular descent from a wealthy patriarch to a confessed felon. Patricia sank to her knees, openly sobbing into her hands, as the reality of losing everything finally crushed her spirit. She had traded her entire family's stability for the illusion of status, and now she was left with absolutely nothing. Ashley tried to step away from her parents, desperate to distance herself from their crimes, but the stain of their fraud covered her completely. Suddenly, a sharp, loud voice cut directly through the chaotic murmurs from behind. It was Spencer Ashley's new husband, who had quietly snuck into the charity gala to confront the family. He marched down the aisle, his face pale and furious. He held his glowing smartphone high in the air, his eyes locked onto his weeping bride. He was completely out of breath, clearly having run past the security checkpoint in the lobby. He stopped right beside Richard, glaring at Ashley with absolute disgust. He raised his phone higher and dropped a devastating bombshell that completely destroyed the golden child forever. The bitter end of this very long and pathetic charade was finally crashing down right now. Spencer stomped down the center aisle, completely ignoring the stunned gasps of the remaining venture capitalists, politicians, and media executives who were still reeling from Richard's disastrous hot mic confession. His usually immaculate, perfectly styled hair was matted to his forehead with sweat. His expensive tailored tuxedo jacket was completely missing. His silk bow tie hung undone around his neck, and his heavily wrinkled dress shirt was untucked. He looked exactly like a man who had spent the last 12 hours tearing his entire life apart, piece by piece, to uncover a massive lie. He shoved violently past the two tabloid reporters. The reporters, smelling an entirely new angle to this catastrophic public meltdown, immediately pivoted their camera lenses away from Richard and aimed them directly at this new highly volatile target. Richard and Patricia froze in their tracks, their faces drained of whatever color they had left, turning a sickly ashen gray. They had spent the last 6 months aggressively curating Spencer to their high society friends as the ultimate unbeatable catch. They had paraded him around country club luncheons and elite networking summits as the billionaire real estate developer who was going to permanently elevate their family to the absolute pinnacle of Manhattan society. Now the crown jewel of their entire social climbing strategy stood before that exact same crowd, looking like a desperate cornered madman. Spencer did not bother grabbing a microphone from the floor. He did not need one to make himself heard. He possessed the raw, unrestrained anger of a man who realized he had been spectacularly played by amateurs. He stopped exactly 10 feet from the stage, pointing a shaking, accusatory finger directly at Ashley. My sister was still trembling beside her parents, clutching her ruined designer clothes. "I filed the annulment papers exactly 3 hours ago," Spencer shouted. His voice echoed brutally off the crystal chandeliers, silencing any lingering whispers in the massive ballroom. "It is officially over. It is entirely legally finished. You are not my wife. You are a complete, pathetic fraud." Ashley let out a strangled, breathless sob, clutching her hands to her chest. "Spencer, please," she begged, her voice barely a whisper. "You do not understand. We can explain everything." "Do not even try to speak to me," Spencer roared back, taking another aggressive step forward. He turned his body slightly, making sure he was addressing not just Ashley, but the entire room of influential guests. He wanted everyone to hear his defense. He wanted to drag them down into the mud with him. "You want to know the truth," he yelled to the crowd of elite investors who were watching the spectacle with morbid fascination. "I am broke. I am completely, utterly bankrupt. I do not have a single dime to my name. My development company went under 2 years ago, and I have been drowning in catastrophic debt ever since." A collective gasp ripped through the audience. A billionaire openly confessing to total financial ruin in the middle of the Grand Plaza ballroom was unheard of. The hedge fund managers and tech moguls murmured to one another, entirely captivated by the pure, unadulterated destruction of a high society facade. "But I am not the real criminal here," Spencer continued, his voice rising in volume as he violently pointed his finger straight at Richard and Patricia. He locked eyes with the mayor, then swept his gaze across the venture capitalists. "I might be broke, but they are the real malicious con artists. They targeted me. They ran a disgusting, calculated scam to trap me into this fake marriage. They deliberately lied about their assets, their properties, and their generational wealth to convince me to marry their completely useless daughter. Richard opened his mouth to shout a denial, but his voice failed him. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming exposure of his darkest secrets. Patricia covered her ears with her hands as if physically trying to block out the reality of her total social annihilation. "Do you want to know what it took to get me to walk down that aisle?" Spencer yelled, projecting his voice to the very back of the room. "Do you want to know the exact price of this ridiculous charade? They promised me a $1 million dowry to marry her. They signed a physical contract promising to wire $1 million into my offshore accounts, the absolute second the marriage certificate was legally filed. They told me it was a standard trust fund disbursement. They looked me dead in the eye and swore they had the liquid capital to pay off my debts just so they could parade me around as their wealthy son-in-law. They promised me $1 million, and they do not even own the house they sleep in." The revelation landed like a physical bomb in the center of the room. $1 million dowry. It was the ultimate, undeniable proof of my parents' absolute moral and financial bankruptcy. They had essentially tried to purchase a high-status husband for their golden child, using money they absolutely did not possess. They had built a massive house of cards on the assumption that my corporate success would eventually bail them out of their insane, fraudulent promises. The societal elite in the audience began to actively pull back, physically retreating from the aisle, as if my family were carrying a highly contagious disease. The disgust on their faces was absolute. The tabloid reporters were snapping photographs at a frantic, blistering pace, capturing every single angle of the devastation. They had the story of the decade, a fake billionaire exposing a fake high society family for forging a dowry contract. Ashley could not take it anymore. The psychological shattering of the golden child was absolute and completely unforgiving. For her entire life, she had been shielded from consequence. She had been coddled, praised, and elevated above everyone else simply for existing. Her parents had sacrificed my childhood, my education, and my emotional well-being solely to construct a flawless, untouchable image for her. They had destroyed my early life to build a pedestal for her to stand on. And now that pedestal had been violently kicked out from under her feet in front of the entire city. Her perfect image was permanently, completely shattered. Ashley let out a guttural, agonizing scream. Her knees gave out entirely. She dropped straight down onto the carpeted floor of the center aisle, her heavy designer dress bunching up around her like a deflated parachute. She buried her face in her hands, having a complete, humiliating meltdown in front of the most powerful people in Manhattan. Her shoulders heaved with violent, uncontrollable sobs. She clawed at her own hair, ruining the expensive extensions, completely lost in a spiral of public shame. She had nothing left. No rich husband, no family fortune, no high society status, and absolutely no future. I stood behind the crystal podium and watched the destruction with cold, clinical detachment. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel the urge to step down and comfort my weeping sister. I did not feel the need to silence the screaming man who had just exposed my parents as the pathetic con artists they truly were. I simply observed the mathematical certainty of their downfall. They had spent decades orchestrating their own ruin. They had woven a massive tangled web of lies, deceit, and financial fraud, fully believing they would never be held accountable. They had treated me like a disposable asset, a human bank account they could drain to fund their delusions of grandeur. Now the bill had finally come due. I watched Richard stare blankly at his sobbing daughter on the floor, utterly incapable of fixing the disaster he had created. His logistics firm was dead. His freedom was in serious jeopardy due to the bank fraud confession. His entire life's work was reduced to a punchline in a tabloid magazine. The absolute finality of their destruction was a masterpiece they had painted themselves. I had merely provided the canvas and the lighting. The ballroom was a cacophony of sound. Spencer continued to hurl insults at Richard, demanding to know how they thought they could get away with faking $1 million transfer. The reporters were shouting questions, asking Richard to confirm the fraudulent second mortgage. The elite guests were murmuring loudly, pulling out their phones to cancel any pending business deals associated with the Vanguard family name. Patricia stood trembling violently in the center of the chaos, her mind utterly incapable of accepting accountability snapped. She could not process the fact that she was the architect of this disaster. Her narcissistic delusion demanded a scapegoat. Her eyes darted wildly around the room before locking directly onto me, standing perfectly calm and untouched on the elevated stage. Her sorrow instantly vanished, replaced by a surge of pure, unadulterated psychotic rage. "This is all your fault!" Patricia screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice shredding with fury. She pointed a jagged finger at Spencer. "You are a liar and a completely worthless failure!" She spun back around to face the stage, her eyes wide and manic. "And you!" Patricia shrieked, locking her furious gaze entirely on me. "You did this to us. You set this up. You ruined my baby's life. And my—" Patricia lost whatever remained of her fractured mind. She let out a wild, animalistic scream and turned to lunge directly toward the stage. Her hands formed into clawed fists as she sprinted up the aisle, clearly intending to physically attack me in front of 500 witnesses. She was entirely blind to the security guards stepping out of the shadows to intercept her. Before Patricia could take 3 furious steps toward the podium, the heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open again. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom swung open with a resounding crash that echoed over the chaotic shouting. Patricia froze mid-lunge, her hands still curled into aggressive claws, her face twisted in a mask of primal fury. The sudden deafening noise at the back of the room commanded absolute attention, snapping the entire crowd out of their collective shock. 3 figures stepped through the entrance, moving with a deliberate, unmistakable authority that instantly changed the air pressure in the room. A plainclothes detective in a crisp gray suit led the way, flanked immediately by 2 uniformed New York Police Department officers. The polished brass of their badges caught the harsh glare of the camera flashes. The timing was so flawlessly precise that it almost looked choreographed, but it was simply the result of meticulous, airtight legal preparation. My corporate legal team had been coordinating with the district attorney and financial fraud divisions since the moment I uncovered the forged wedding contract and the illegal second mortgage. We had presented them with an irrefutable mountain of certified evidence, digital paper trails, and bank logs, proving my parents had committed felony identity theft and federal wire fraud. The police were already en route to the gala to execute the arrest warrants. Richard screaming his full voluntary confession into a live microphone, broadcasting to 500 people, was just an incredibly convenient bonus. The detective walked straight down the center aisle, his eyes locked onto my parents. The crowd of elite investors, venture capitalists, and politicians instinctively parted, creating a wide, clear path. Nobody wanted to be standing too close to the blast radius. The tabloid reporters frantically scrambled out of the way, but kept their camera shutters firing at lightning speed, documenting every single second of the impending arrest. Richard Vanguard. Patricia. Vanguard, the detective said, his voice projecting clearly across the suddenly silent ballroom. He pulled a folded set of warrants from the inside pocket of his suit jacket. "I am Detective Miller with the Financial Crimes Division. We have warrants for your immediate arrest on multiple counts of felony identity theft, grand larceny, and federal bank fraud." Patricia let out a high-pitched, breathless squeak. Her arms dropped to her sides. All the psychotic, violent rage that had possessed her a fraction of a second ago completely evaporated, replaced instantly by raw, unfiltered terror. She looked at the uniformed officers approaching her and began to hyperventilate. "No!" she gasped, shaking her head and taking a stumbling step backward. "No, you do not understand. This is a private event. This is a charity gala. We are respectable people. We are the Vanguard family. You cannot do this to us here. We know the mayor." The mayor, seated at the front, VIP table, kept his eyes firmly fixed on his completely empty champagne flute, entirely refusing to look in her direction. He had already mentally drafted the press release, distancing his administration from Richard's logistics firm. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." One of the uniformed officers instructed Patricia, his tone entirely devoid of sympathy. He reached for the steel handcuffs clipped to his duty belt. Richard seemed to have entirely lost his ability to speak. The arrogant, booming patriarch who had just threatened to destroy my company and burn my life to the ground was completely gone. He stared blankly at the arrest warrants in the detective's hand, as if reading a language he did not understand. He had spent his entire adult life operating under the arrogant assumption that wealth and social status provided an impenetrable shield against consequences. He believed rules were constructed entirely for other lesser people. The realization that he was just a common criminal about to be processed into the criminal justice system completely broke his mind. "Richard, place your hands behind your back," the second officer ordered, stepping up right behind him. When the cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs snapped shut around Richard's wrists, the metallic click echoed through the dead silent ballroom like a gunshot. A second later, the identical sound rang out as Patricia was cuffed. The sheer, overwhelming humiliation of the moment was absolute. They were standing in the very center of the Grand Plaza ballroom, surrounded by the exact high society elite they had spent decades trying to impress, manipulate, and emulate. They were wearing tens of thousands of dollars in tailored formal wear and stolen diamonds currently restrained by police officers like common thieves. This was the ultimate, inescapable karma. They had deliberately crashed my corporate gala with the explicit intention of destroying my professional reputation. They had planned to humiliate me in front of my peers, to force me into submission through public shame. Instead, they had constructed the perfect, highly publicized stage for their own total annihilation. The humiliation they had maliciously tried to inflict upon me had returned to them tenfold. "You have the right to remain silent," Detective Miller stated, reading them their Miranda rights as the officers secured their restraints. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Patricia began to weep uncontrollably. The thick, expensive mascara she had applied so carefully was now running in dark, ugly streaks down her cheeks. Her designer gown dragged heavily on the carpet as the officer gently but firmly turned her toward the exit. She looked pleadingly at the faces of the wealthy socialites seated at the tables, searching desperately for a single ally, a single sympathetic glance. She found absolutely nothing. The faces staring back at her were masks of cold contempt and morbid fascination. High society does not forgive public failure, and they violently reject exposed frauds. Richard did not look at anyone. His head hung low, his chin nearly resting on his chest. His shoulders were completely slumped in utter, irreversible defeat. The walk of shame down the center aisle of the ballroom felt like it took an eternity. Every single step they took toward the heavy oak doors was documented by the relentless, blinding flashes of the tabloid cameras. Tomorrow morning, their handcuffed, weeping faces would be plastered across the front page of every major newspaper and financial publication in the country. Their social standing was not just damaged, it was permanently, surgically eradicated. They would never attend another country club luncheon. They would never secure another business loan. They would never be welcome in polite society again. The heavy oak doors closed behind them with a resounding thud, sealing their fate. The immediate threat was gone, but the atmosphere in the ballroom remained highly charged and incredibly chaotic. The silence finally broke, replaced by a deafening roar of overlapping conversations. The elite guests were already standing up from their tables, abandoning their half-eaten gourmet dinners and expensive drinks. The entertainment value of the evening had clearly peaked, and the networking opportunities were completely dead. No one wanted to linger at the scene of a massive federal crime. My security team immediately moved into action, seamlessly coordinating with the venue staff to begin ushering the guests toward the exits in an orderly fashion. I nodded to my head of security, signaling him to gently escort the tabloid reporters out of the room. They had captured enough evidence to destroy my parents 10 times over, and I did not need them lingering to ask me questions. I had zero intention of giving a press conference tonight. The verified documents projected on the screen and Richard's hot mic confession spoke entirely for themselves. Spencer had already vanished. The second the police had entered the room, he had turned and slipped out through a side door, eager to distance himself from the toxic fallout of the Vanguard family. He had delivered his final fatal blow to Ashley's ego and then retreated back into the shadows to deal with his own monumental bankruptcy. The grand ballroom slowly began to empty. The clinking of glasses and the loud, frantic voices faded into the hallways as the crowd dispersed into the Manhattan night. The cleaning staff began to quietly clear the abandoned tables, avoiding the center aisle completely. Within 10 minutes, the massive cavernous room was practically deserted. The towering projection screen behind me still displayed the official police report, casting a harsh, bright light across the stage. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the small remote, and clicked the button, turning the projector off. The room plunged into a softer, warmer light from the chandeliers above. I let out a long, slow breath, feeling the intense, suffocating adrenaline finally begin to recede from my veins. My hands, which had been gripping the edges of the crystal podium with white-knuckled force, slowly relaxed. The war was officially over. The decades of emotional manipulation, the constant financial theft, and the relentless psychological abuse were entirely finished. I had surgically removed the cancer from my life. I gathered my notes from the podium. I reached down and picked up my sleek black leather briefcase. I placed the documents inside and retrieved my laptop from the lower shelf of the podium. The mechanical, mundane act of packing my belongings felt incredibly grounding after the absolute insanity of the past 30 minutes. As I zipped the briefcase closed, a soft, pathetic sound echoed from the floor below the stage. I looked down over the edge of the podium. Ashley was still there. She had not moved an inch since Spencer had publicly humiliated her and filed for the annulment. She was sitting completely alone on the carpeted floor of the center aisle. Her massive, extravagant designer dress was pooled around her in a chaotic, wrinkled mess. Her face was buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with quiet, exhausted tears. Her parents were in the back of a police cruiser. Her fake billionaire husband had publicly dumped her. Her entire identity, which had been entirely dependent on her parents' fraudulent wealth and her own manufactured superiority, had completely dissolved into nothing. She slowly lowered her hands and looked up at me. Her makeup was entirely ruined, her face pale and streaked with dark tears. The arrogant, entitled golden child was completely gone. She looked small, lost, and entirely broken. She stared up at the stage, watching me as I calmly snapped the locks on my briefcase shut. We were the only two people left in the center of the room. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of 30 years of history. I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing. No anger, no resentment, and certainly no pity. She had actively participated in my destruction for years. She had laughed while my parents drained my bank accounts. She had smiled while they forged my signature. She was not an innocent victim of their manipulation. She was a willing accomplice who was only crying because the scam had finally failed. I picked up my briefcase by the handle and stepped out from behind the crystal podium. I did not say a single word to her. There was nothing left to say. I turned my back on my sister and walked steadily toward the exit, my heels clicking sharply against the floor, leaving her entirely alone in the ruins of the life she thought she deserved. Ashley did not stay seated on the floor for long. The harsh, incredibly quiet reality of her new, isolated existence seemed to physically jolt her out of her paralyzed state of absolute shock. She scrambled to her feet, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. The massive tiered skirt of her custom designer wedding dress caught beneath her expensive heels, causing her to violently stumble and scrape her bare knees against the carpeted aisle, but she did not stop her frantic momentum. She crawled and clawed her way toward the elevated edge of the stage. The illusion of the graceful, untouchable golden child was completely gone, replaced instantly by the frantic, terrified energy of a cornered animal. Her meticulously styled hair had entirely unraveled, sending long, tangled strands clinging to the wet, ruined makeup on her cheeks. Her breathing was harsh and ragged, echoing loudly in the cavernous, newly emptied space of the grand ballroom. Spencer was gone. The fake billionaire who was supposed to permanently fund her life of endless luxury had vanished into the Manhattan night, leaving her with absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of public humiliation. Her parents, the architects of her entire false reality, were currently sitting in the back of a police cruiser on their way to a holding cell for federal bank fraud and identity theft. Their bank accounts were locked down by federal authorities. The credit cards Ashley carried in her expensive clutch were now completely useless pieces of plastic. She had no money to pay for a hotel room. She had no home to return to as the Hamptons estate legally belonged to Vanguard Hospitality. She reached the edge of the stage, gripping the polished wood trim with white-knuckled desperation. She looked up at me, her chest heaving with violent, uncontrollable sobs. Her eyes, usually so full of arrogant disdain, were now wide with absolute, unfiltered panic. She was entirely alone, and the realization was visibly tearing her apart. "Please, Mel," she begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine that echoed off the high ceiling. "Please, you have to help me right now. I have absolutely nothing left." Spencer filed for an annulment. "He completely abandoned me. I do not have a single dollar to my name. My credit cards are declining. I cannot even afford a cab ride out of this city. You have to listen to me. I do not have a place to stay tonight. The apartment in the city was under Richard's company name, and the federal agents are probably already seizing it. I have nowhere to go. You own Vanguard Hospitality. You have dozens of luxury properties all over the country. You have massive residential complexes right here in New York. Just let me stay in one of them. I do not care which one. It does not even have to be a penthouse. Just give me a small apartment, a basic room. I just need a roof over my head tonight. You can easily afford it. It would not cost you anything to just let me quietly move into one of your buildings. And I need money, Mel. I need a steady income. Give me a job at your company. I can work hard. I can learn the hospitality business. You can make me a consultant or a creative director. You control the entire corporate board. You can just write up an employment contract. We are family. We are sisters. You cannot just leave your own sister to freeze on the streets. Please, Mel, look at me. I am begging you. I am on my knees begging you for mercy. I will do whatever you want. I will publicly apologize to you. I will tell the press that you are the victim. Just do not leave me here with nothing. You are the only family I have left who is not in handcuffs. You have to save me." I stopped packing my laptop into my leather briefcase, my hands stilled, entirely hovering motionless over the brass clasps. I slowly lifted my head and looked directly down at the weeping, pathetic woman gripping the edge of my stage. I observed the total destruction of her pristine image with a cold, unwavering detachment. This was the exact same woman who had smirked at me with pure malicious delight just days ago. I remembered standing outside her extravagant wedding reception, shivering in the freezing rain, humiliated by the security guard she had instructed to throw me out. I remembered the sheer enjoyment radiating from her face as she watched me suffer the indignity of being publicly discarded. She had never once viewed me as a sister. For 30 years I was nothing but a convenient punching bag for her deep insecurities and a permanent scapegoat for her endless personal failures. She had actively participated in my financial abuse. She had happily tried on the wedding dress that was paid for with my stolen money. She felt absolutely zero remorse when my parents forged my signature and attempted to destroy my corporate reputation. Her tears right now were not born of genuine guilt or moral regret. They were born entirely of self-pity. She was only crying because the fraudulent safety net she had relied on her entire life had finally collapsed into dust. She was begging for a high-paying executive job she was entirely unqualified for, demanding a luxury apartment she had absolutely no legal or moral right to, simply because she still genuinely believed she was inherently entitled to my hard-earned resources. She was fully expecting the lifelong toxic dynamic of my subservience to suddenly reassert itself, hoping that the sheer volume of her tears would magically erase decades of targeted intentional cruelty. I let the heavy, dead silence of the abandoned ballroom stretch out for a long, agonizing minute. I actively wanted her to sit in the quiet aftermath of her own spectacular destruction. I wanted her to fully feel the absolute void where her unearned privilege and endless arrogance used to reside. I deliberately stepped away from the crystal podium and walked to the very edge of the carpeted stage, looking directly down into her tear-streaked, panicked face. The desperate, frantic hope in her eyes flared brightly for a fraction of a second, completely misinterpreting my silence as a sign of familial yielding. She eagerly reached her hand up toward me, her massive diamond engagement ring catching the ambient light of the overhead crystal chandeliers. I did not reach my hand back to meet hers. I maintained a posture of lethal, absolute calm. My voice when I finally spoke was quiet, completely steady, and utterly devoid of any emotional warmth or sisterly affection. It was the exacting voice of a chief executive officer terminating a deeply unprofitable, highly toxic contract. "Only family is allowed in my life, Ashley. You are not invited. Leave." The words struck her like physical blows to the chest. Her outstretched hand dropped limply back down to the carpet. The desperate, pleading light in her eyes extinguished, instantly replaced by the hollow, terrifying realization of total, permanent rejection. I did not wait for her to formulate another pathetic excuse or launch into another hysterical fit of sobbing. I turned my back to her with absolute, unwavering finality. I walked smoothly back to the podium, snapped the brass locks on my briefcase shut with a sharp, decisive click, and walked steadily toward the side exit of the elevated stage. The rhythmic, confident sound of my heels echoed loudly through the massive space, drowning out the pathetic sounds of her crying. I pushed through the heavy exit doors and walked out into the cool Manhattan night, leaving my sister entirely alone on the floor of the empty ballroom to face the absolute ruin she had actively orchestrated. 3 weeks passed in a relentless, highly publicized whirlwind of legal filings, emergency corporate audits, and an insatiable media frenzy. The spectacular downfall of the Vanguard family dominated the national news cycles 24 hours a day. The tabloid photographs of Richard and Patricia being led out of the charity gala in handcuffs became the defining image of high society corruption. The district attorney's office moved with unprecedented speed, heavily armed with the airtight mountain of certified financial evidence my legal team had provided. The forged wedding venue contracts, the fraudulent second mortgage applications, and the decades of falsified logistics ledgers were meticulously laid out before a very angry grand jury. The federal indictments were handed down swiftly and brutally, permanently, freezing every single remaining asset connected to my parents' names. The air inside the federal courthouse was incredibly sterile, heavy with the weight of impending justice. I sat perfectly still in the front row of the polished wooden gallery benches, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, projecting the authority of an executive. I stared straight ahead across the central aisle of the courtroom. Sitting directly at the defense table, flanked by exhausted public defenders they furiously despised, were Richard and Patricia. They were entirely stripped of their expensive designer suits and custom jewelry, wearing identical bright orange institutional jumpsuits. The heavy silver chains secured tightly around their thin waists clinked very softly as they nervously shifted in their hard wooden chairs. They looked incredibly small, heavily aged, and completely defeated. The heavy mahogany doors at the very front of the massive courtroom swung open, and the armed bailiff instructed the room to rise. The final legal battle was about to begin. The federal justice system operates with a terrifying mechanical efficiency that leaves absolutely no room for high society posturing. There were no country club pleasantries exchanged in this sterile environment. There were no velvet ropes or VIP lists. There was only the cold, unyielding weight of the law pressing down on the two people who had spent their entire lives believing they were immune to it. Richard and Patricia sat at the defense table, their bright orange institutional jumpsuits clashing violently with the somber mahogany paneling of the courtroom. The vibrant fabric seemed to swallow them whole, erasing every trace of the wealthy, untouchable personas they had meticulously crafted over 3 decades. Without her expensive silk scarves, contouring makeup, and designer jewelry, my mother looked remarkably ordinary. She looked small, frail, and utterly terrified. Richard was a hollow shell of the booming patriarch who had tried to command the charity gala just weeks prior. He stared blankly at the polished wooden table in front of him, his shoulders completely collapsed, his hands shackled to a waist chain that clinked harshly every time he drew a shuddering breath. They were facing an absolute avalanche of federal charges: felony forgery, first-degree identity theft, aggravated federal bank fraud. The prosecutors had not missed a single detail. My corporate legal team had handed them a perfectly wrapped package of certified digital trails, IP addresses, and sworn affidavits from the venue coordinators. The trail of stolen money was illuminated so brightly that even a first-year law student could secure a conviction. My parents had leveraged my name and my company's assets to secure a second mortgage on a property they no longer owned, attempting to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars to fund Ashley's fake billionaire wedding. They had committed these crimes with the arrogant certainty that I would simply cover their tracks to avoid public embarrassment. They had fundamentally miscalculated the person I had become. From my seat in the front row of the gallery, I watched their state-appointed defense attorney shuffle his papers. He was an overworked, exhausted public defender who clearly recognized a losing battle when he saw one. He did not possess the slick, polished demeanor of the expensive corporate lawyers my father used to hire. Richard's personal assets had been entirely frozen by the federal government the moment the indictment was handed down, leaving him entirely dependent on the public system he had spent his life mocking. The defense attorney leaned over, whispered something to Richard, and then stood up. He smoothed his wrinkled suit jacket and walked slowly across the center aisle, approaching the low wooden partition that separated the gallery from the legal teams. He signaled to my lead counsel, Marcus, asking for a brief off-the-record conference before the judge took the bench. Marcus glanced back at me. I gave a single slight nod of approval. I wanted to hear exactly how desperate they had become. Marcus stepped to the partition, and I leaned forward to listen to the hushed exchange. "My clients are willing to make a full, immediate plea arrangement," the public defender whispered, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. "They want to avoid trial. They are prepared to offer a comprehensive settlement to your client right now if she agrees to ask the district attorney for leniency and drop the civil components of the fraud charges." Marcus did not flinch. He simply stared at the man with cold, professional detachment. "What exactly are your clients proposing to offer?" Marcus asked, his voice entirely devoid of interest. "They have zero liquid capital. Their primary residence is owned by Vanguard Hospitality, and their commercial logistics firm is currently being liquidated by federal creditors. They have nothing to bargain with. They are prepared to issue a formal, publicly documented apology," the defense attorney stated, his voice lacking any real conviction. "They will issue a signed statement taking full responsibility for the wedding venue dispute. Furthermore, they are willing to sign a legally binding waiver permanently relinquishing any future claims to Melanie's corporate assets, personal properties, or financial holdings. In exchange, they want the bank fraud charges reduced to a misdemeanor and a guarantee of 0 jail time." A harsh, quiet laugh escaped my lips before I could stop it. I stood up from the gallery bench and stepped directly up to the wooden partition, standing shoulder to shoulder with Marcus. The defense attorney looked at me, clearly intimidated by the sheer, unyielding ice in my expression. "You can tell my parents that their offer is fundamentally insulting," I said, keeping my voice low but razor sharp. "They are offering to publicly apologize for a wedding venue dispute when they are currently facing 20 years for federal bank fraud. They are offering to relinquish their claims to my assets as if they ever had a legitimate claim in the first place. You cannot bargain away something you do not own. They are entirely bankrupt, both financially and morally, and they are still trying to negotiate from a position of imagined power. They genuinely believe they can charm their way out of a federal indictment with a piece of paper and a fake apology." The public defender sighed, dropping his gaze to the floor. "I am legally obligated to present their offer," he murmured. I told them it was highly unlikely you would accept. You can tell Richard and Patricia that I refuse outright, I stated with absolute finality. I am not dropping a single charge. I am not asking the district attorney for leniency. I am not settling this quietly. They orchestrated this entire disaster. They forged my signature. They tried to publicly destroy my life's work in front of 500 people to cover their own massive financial crimes. They are going to face the exact unmitigated consequences of their actions. There will be no deals. There will be no graceful exit. The defense attorney nodded slowly, completely unsurprised by my response. He turned and walked back to the defense table, leaning down to whisper my answer into Richard's ear. I watched my father's face contort in pure helpless rage. His shackled hands balled into tight fists. He glared at me across the courtroom, his eyes burning with the toxic, familiar fury of a man who was finally completely out of options. Patricia buried her face in her chained hands, her shoulders shaking violently as the reality of her impending incarceration fully settled over her. The golden parachute they had expected me to deploy was never coming, but I was not entirely finished. I turned to Marcus and reached into my leather briefcase. I pulled out a thick black binder heavily secured with legal seals and digital authentication tags. This was the final nail in their coffin, the ultimate weapon I had been holding in reserve until this exact moment. Give this directly to the lead prosecutor, I instructed Marcus, handing the heavy binder over the partition. The prosecutor, a sharp, incredibly focused woman who had been watching our exchange from the prosecution table, immediately stood up and walked over to receive the file. What is this? The prosecutor asked, taking the binder and noting its substantial weight. That is a complete, independently audited, decade-long financial ledger, I explained smoothly, making sure my voice carried just enough for Richard and Patricia to hear the words. For the past 10 years, my parents have engaged in a systematic, highly calculated pattern of financial abuse and extortion. Long before the forged wedding contract, they were actively draining educational accounts, falsifying tax documents to claim my early business income, and aggressively siphoning money from vulnerable relatives to fund their luxury lifestyle. Every single stolen dollar, every manipulated credit line, and every coerced bank transfer is documented, cross-referenced, and verified by forensic accountants within those pages. It establishes a crystal-clear, undeniable history of criminal behavior. The prosecutor's eyes widened as she flipped open the cover, scanning the first few pages of the executive summary. The sheer volume of the evidence was staggering. It painted a horrifying picture of a couple who viewed their own children and extended family as nothing more than walking ATMs. This proves that the bank fraud regarding the second mortgage was not a one-time desperate mistake. I continued, my voice echoing coldly in the quiet courtroom. This proves that fraud is their entire business model. This evidence guarantees that they will be prosecuted as habitual systemic financial predators. Richard let out a strangled, breathless sound from the defense table. He had just realized what I had handed over. He knew exactly what was in that binder. He had spent years bullying me into silence regarding those early financial discrepancies, always threatening to ruin my credit or destroy my reputation if I ever spoke out. He thought those secrets were buried forever. He never imagined I would keep every single receipt, every single bank statement, and every single threatening email he had ever sent me. He never anticipated that the scared, obedient daughter he had relentlessly exploited would eventually grow up to wield his own crimes against him with absolute precision. This ledger guarantees maximum sentencing, Marcus added, looking directly at the prosecutor. It will also trigger mandatory federal financial blacklisting. Once this is entered into the public record, they will never be able to secure a line of credit, open a corporate bank account, or manage a business entity again. Their financial existence will be permanently legally terminated. The prosecutor nodded sharply, a grim smile touching the corners of her mouth. She clutched the heavy binder to her chest and walked briskly back to her table, immediately beginning to organize the new evidence for her opening statement. The finality of the moment was absolute. There were no loopholes left. There were no favors they could call in. Richard and Patricia were completely surrounded by the inescapable consequences of their own toxic arrogance. They had valued aesthetics' high society status and the illusion of wealth far above the life safety and well-being of their own daughter. They had sacrificed my entire childhood to build a fake empire, and now they were going to spend the rest of their lives paying the price in a federal penitentiary. The heavy mahogany doors at the side of the room opened, and the bailiff stepped out. "All rise," the bailiff commanded, his voice booming with unquestionable authority. The entire courtroom stood in unison. Richard and Patricia struggled to their feet, their heavy chains rattling loudly against the wooden chairs. I stood tall, my shoulders squared, watching the judge sweep into the room in his flowing black robes. He climbed the steps to the elevated bench, his expression grave and unyielding. He arranged his files, adjusted his reading glasses, and picked up the polished wooden gavel. He surveyed the courtroom, his eyes briefly sweeping past the prosecution, the gallery, and finally settling entirely on my parents, trembling at the defense table. The judge's gavel bangs down, preparing to deliver the final verdict, cementing the fate of the parents who valued aesthetics over their own daughter. The sharp crack of the wooden gavel echoed like a gunshot through the silent courtroom. Judge Harrison adjusted his microphone and looked directly down at Richard and Patricia Vanguard. The look of utter disgust on the judge's face mirrored the sentiments of every decent person who had reviewed this case. "You stand before this court convicted of felony identity theft, grand larceny, and federal bank fraud." The judge began, his voice projecting a heavy, uncompromising authority. "However, the true severity of your crimes extends far beyond the financial statutes you so brazenly violated. The evidence presented by the prosecution details a systematic, decades-long campaign of financial and emotional extortion directed at your own daughter. You treated a human being, your own flesh and blood, as nothing more than a disposable asset to fund your vanity and fuel your narcissistic delusions. You utilized her credit, forged her signature, and attempted to publicly humiliate her to mask your own catastrophic failures. There is absolutely no leniency for such calculated predatory behavior in my courtroom." Patricia began to sob loudly, her shoulders shaking violently beneath the bright orange fabric of her jumpsuit. She reached out, trying to grab her husband's chained hands, but Richard remained completely paralyzed, staring blankly at the polished mahogany bench. "It is the ruling of this court," the judge continued, completely ignoring Patricia's theatrical display of grief, "that Richard Vanguard is sentenced to 12 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. Patricia Vanguard, you are sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. Furthermore, I am ordering complete and total financial restitution to the victim, Melanie Vanguard. To satisfy this order, all of your remaining personal and corporate assets, including your frozen bank accounts, any remaining real estate equity, and all liquidated business holdings will be seized immediately by federal authorities. You are effectively and permanently bankrupted. You will never again hold a line of credit, manage an investment portfolio, or serve as a corporate officer." The gavel struck the sounding block a second time with absolute finality. "Court is adjourned." The heavy finality of the sentence hung in the sterile air of the courtroom. The public defender hurriedly gathered his files and practically sprinted away from the defense table, eager to wash his hands of the entire Vanguard family. Two armed bailiffs stepped forward, grasping Richard and Patricia firmly by the arms. "Stand up," one of the officers ordered gruffly. Richard complied mechanically. The arrogant, booming patriarch was gone forever, replaced by a hollow shell of a man who finally understood that his money could not buy his freedom. Patricia dragged her feet, weeping hysterically, as the officers pulled her toward the side exit leading to the holding cells. She looked back over her shoulder, her mascara running in dark streaks down her pale, terrified face, searching the gallery for any sign of sympathy. Her eyes met mine for a fleeting second. She found absolutely nothing but cold, clinical detachment. I did not flinch. I did not offer a comforting smile. I simply watched the heavy wooden door close behind them, sealing them away in the dark, restricted world they had earned. Marcus turned to me with a small, satisfied nod. "We won," he stated quietly, snapping his briefcase shut. "It is officially over." I stood up from the hard wooden bench and smoothed the front of my tailored suit jacket. Yes, it is, I replied. The oppressive, suffocating weight I had carried on my shoulders since childhood instantly evaporated. The constant paranoia, the fear of financial ruin, the endless gaslighting, all of it was permanently eradicated. My parents were no longer a threat. They were just inmates in a federal system. I walked out of the courtroom, flanked by my legal team, my head held high and my posture relaxed. We moved smoothly down the marble corridors of the courthouse, bypassing the restricted press areas. I pushed open the heavy brass and glass front doors and stepped out onto the wide stone landing. The bright, blinding sunlight of a clear Manhattan afternoon washed over me. I took a deep breath of the crisp city air, feeling a profound, undeniable sense of absolute liberation. I walked slowly down the massive granite steps of the federal courthouse, the rhythmic click of my heels echoing off the stone. The plaza below was bustling with lawyers, clerks, and pedestrians navigating the busy city streets. My private driver was idling at the curb in a sleek black luxury sedan, the engine purring softly. As I reached the bottom of the stairs and began walking toward the waiting car, a flash of color near a hot dog stand caught my eye. I paused, my gaze narrowing on a figure standing near the edge of the busy sidewalk. It was Ashley. The former golden child of the Vanguard family was standing awkwardly near a trash can, holding a half-empty cup of cheap coffee. The transformation was so jarringly severe that I almost did not recognize her. The custom designer dresses, the flawless professional blowouts, and the thousands of dollars of curated jewelry were entirely gone. She was wearing a highly unflattering, heavily wrinkled uniform consisting of stiff khaki pants and a bright blue polo shirt. A cheap plastic name tag was pinned crookedly to her chest, bearing the logo of a massive low-tier retail chain store located a few blocks away. The psychological shattering of her fake high society reality had clearly taken a brutal physical toll. Her hair was pulled back in a messy, unwashed ponytail. Her posture, once defined by an insufferable manufactured superiority, was heavily slumped. She looked utterly exhausted, her shoulders hunched against the mild breeze. She was wearing cheap, worn-out sneakers that looked wildly out of place on the feet of a woman who previously refused to walk in anything other than imported Italian leather. This was the harsh, unforgiving reality of the life she now faced. Without Richard and Patricia to fund her delusions, without a fake billionaire husband to elevate her status, she had been forced to enter the actual workforce. She was currently surviving on minimum wage, dealing with angry retail customers, and stocking shelves to afford a tiny shared apartment somewhere deep in the outer boroughs. The pedestal had been violently kicked out from under her, and she had hit the concrete floor of reality at maximum speed. She looked up from her coffee cup and saw me standing near the black sedan. Her eyes widened instantly, recognizing the custom tailoring of my suit and the undeniable aura of corporate success I projected. The contrast between us was absolute and completely staggering. She took a hesitant, trembling step forward. Her lips parted and she raised one hand slightly, her fingers twitching in a desperate, silent plea. She did not say a single word, but the begging was written across every inch of her tired face. She was silently asking for a handout. She was asking for me to roll down the window, hand her a wad of cash, and rescue her from the humiliating retail hell she was currently trapped in. She wanted the successful, wealthy sister she had mercilessly bullied her entire life to suddenly become her financial savior. She was hoping that seeing her in a cheap blue polo shirt would trigger some hidden reserve of familial pity. She was entirely wrong. I stood on the pavement and stared back at her with the exact same cold, unyielding indifference I had shown our parents inside the courtroom. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy. I remembered the decades of her cruel laughter. I remembered her actively plotting to steal my company. I remembered her standing on the stage of the grand ballroom fully expecting me to house and employ her after she had helped forge my signature on a $1 million contract. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a pair of dark, polarized designer sunglasses. I maintained direct eye contact with her as I slowly unfolded the frames and slid the dark lenses over my eyes, completely blocking her from my vision. I turned my back on her silent, pathetic begging and reached for the heavy door of my car. My driver quickly pulled the heavy door wide open. I slid into the immaculate leather interior of the spacious back seat, settling comfortably into the plush cushions. I did not look out the tinted window. I officially severed all remaining emotional ties to the Vanguard family. The driver smoothly pulled away, leaving Ashley completely alone on the pavement. I left the toxic ashes entirely behind me. Exactly 6 months later, I was quietly sitting in my large corner office when my cell phone vibrated loudly across my desk. I picked up the device and read the bright screen. It was an automated notification from the official federal prison communication system. Patricia was attempting one last highly desperate manipulation from behind solid steel bars. I tapped the screen to accept the automated prompt, the sterile mechanical voice of the prison operator announcing a prepaid call from an inmate at the Danbury Federal Correctional Institution. I pressed the phone to my ear, leaning back into my leather chair. I did not say hello. I simply waited for the recording to click over to the live line. Melanie Patricia's voice crackled through the receiver. It was instantly grating, laced with heavy static and the unmistakable breathless cadence of manufactured panic. Melanie, thank God. Please do not hang up. You have to listen to me. I remained entirely silent, my face a mask of clinical detachment. It is a nightmare in here, Patricia sobbed, the sound wet and highly exaggerated. The conditions are barbaric. They treat us like animals. Your father is sick, Melanie. His heart cannot take this kind of stress, and the public defenders are completely useless. They are doing absolutely nothing to help us file an appeal. They do not care about us. She paused, clearly waiting for me to offer a sympathetic gasp or a hurried promise of rescue. When the line remained dead silent, her tone shifted, growing sharper and more demanding beneath the fake tears. You have the money, Melanie. You have the resources. You need to hire us a real appeals lawyer, a top-tier defense firm. We know you can afford it now more than ever since you took everything from us. You cannot just leave your own flesh and blood to rot in this concrete hellhole. We are your parents. Blood is thicker than water. You owe us this. You have to save us. I sat perfectly still, staring out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my office. For 30 years, that exact tone of voice, that precise mixture of guilt-tripping and aggressive entitlement, would have sent a spike of pure conditioned anxiety straight through my chest. I would have scrambled to fix the problem, desperate to earn a fleeting crumb of her approval, terrified of the emotional withdrawal that would immediately follow my failure to comply. I would have spent thousands of dollars to fix her mistakes, all while apologizing for not doing it fast enough. But today, listening to the woman who had happily forged my signature and attempted to destroy my life's work, I felt absolutely nothing. The anxiety was entirely gone. The anger had completely burned itself out. The lingering, pathetic hope that she might one day magically transform into a decent mother had been permanently extinguished. I did not feel rage. I did not feel sadness. I did not even feel a passing spark of pity for the miserable, caged reality she had constructed for herself. I simply felt an expansive, overwhelming emptiness regarding the Vanguard family. They were strangers to me. They were obsolete data points on a spreadsheet I had already permanently deleted. Melanie, answer me! Patricia demanded, her voice rising in genuine panic as my prolonged silence stretched on. Do not do this. You have to help your family. I slowly pulled the phone away from my ear. I did not utter a single syllable in response. I looked at the glowing red button on the screen. With one deliberate, perfectly calm tap of my index finger, I ended the call. I immediately navigated to the settings menu and permanently blocked the number. I locked the device, placed it face down on the polished mahogany surface of my desk, and let out a long, steady breath. The absolute finality of that incredibly simple digital action was deeply and incredibly profound. The last remaining tether to my toxic past had been cleanly and permanently severed. I slowly stood up from my leather chair and meticulously smoothed the front of my tailored white linen trousers. I walked toward the heavy glass doors at the far end of my office, pushing them open and stepping out into the blinding, brilliant light of the afternoon. The sterile, perfectly air-conditioned atmosphere of the workspace instantly gave way to the warm, fragrant breeze of the Mediterranean Sea. The scene around me was flawlessly, breathtakingly perfect. I was standing on the sun-drenched, expansive limestone terrace of my newest, most ambitious corporate acquisition. It was a massive, historic stone villa perched high on a jagged cliff in the south of France, overlooking the glittering sapphire expanse of the Côte d'Azur. I had finalized the purchase exactly 48 hours ago, officially adding the crown jewel of the French Riviera to the Vanguard hospitality portfolio. The estate was a masterpiece of classic European architecture and modern ultra-luxury design, featuring terraced olive groves, infinity pools that seemed to drop off into the ocean, and panoramic views that stretched for miles along the spectacular coastline. The terrace was alive with vibrant, joyful energy. I walked slowly toward the edge of the stone balustrade, taking in the scene playing out in front of me. I was completely and entirely surrounded by my chosen family. These were not people bound to me by the random, unfortunate accident of biological genetics. These were the brilliant, fiercely loyal individuals who had actively stood by me in the trenches, who had fought alongside me when my own blood relatives tried to bury me alive. Marcus, my lead corporate counsel, was standing near a marble table laughing loudly at a joke being told by my chief financial officer. They were reviewing the final integration documents for the villa, clearly thrilled with the mathematical perfection of the deal we had just closed. Across the terrace, Sarah, my oldest friend and trusted creative director, was directing a photographer to capture the perfect lighting for the upcoming global press release. She spotted me walking out and immediately broke into a massive, radiant smile, waving me over. These people celebrated my brilliance. They nurtured my resilience. They never once viewed me as a disposable asset or a human bank account to be drained and discarded. They pushed me to exceed my own expectations, and they caught me when the weight of the corporate world threatened to pull me under. They had witnessed the absolute worst of my family's betrayal, and instead of pulling away or judging me for the chaos, they had formed an impenetrable protective wall around my business and my sanity. This was what actual loyalty looked like. This was the authentic, unwavering support I had spent my entire childhood desperately searching for in all the wrong places. A uniformed waiter approached me seamlessly, holding a silver tray bearing a single perfectly chilled crystal flute of vintage champagne. I smiled, thanked him softly, and took the glass. The condensation felt cool and grounding against my skin. "Attention, everyone!" Marcus called out, his booming voice easily cutting through the ambient music and the sound of the crashing waves below. He raised his own glass high in the air, turning to face me. The conversations across the terrace instantly quieted, as the entire team gathered around the center of the patio, their faces glowing with genuine pride and shared accomplishment. "I want to propose a toast," Marcus said, his eyes locking onto mine with profound professional respect. "To Melanie. Just a few short months ago, we were fighting the hardest, ugliest battle this company has ever faced. We were fighting against people who should have been your biggest protectors, but instead chose to be your worst enemies. They tried to tear down everything you built because they could not control it. But you did not break. You did not compromise your vision, and you absolutely refused to surrender the empire you built with your own two hands." Sarah raised her glass higher, nodding in fierce agreement. "You showed everyone what true strength looks like, Mel," she added, her voice thick with genuine emotion. "You taught us that we do not have to accept the roles other people try to force on us. Today we are standing on the terrace of the most exclusive, highly coveted luxury property in the south of France." Marcus continued, gesturing broadly to the stunning estate surrounding us. "A property that now legally belongs entirely to Vanguard Hospitality. You took the ashes of a massive betrayal and used them to build an international legacy that is completely untouchable. You are the sole architect of your own phenomenal destiny. To Melanie, and to the absolute undisputed triumph of Vanguard." To Melanie, the entire team echoed in unison, the sound ringing out like a victorious anthem across the sunlit terrace. The crisp musical chime of a dozen crystal glasses clinking together filled the air. I looked at the smiling, supportive faces surrounding me, feeling a deep, powerful surge of pure gratitude swell in my chest. I raised my flute in acknowledgement, holding their gaze for a long, meaningful moment. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the champagne. The crisp, bright flavor danced across my palate, a perfect physical manifestation of the victory we were celebrating. I turned slightly, resting my hand on the sun-warmed stone of the balustrade, and looked out over the endless glittering horizon. The Mediterranean Sea stretched out infinitely before me, a vast, uninterrupted expanse of vibrant blue meeting the clear, cloudless sky. There were no limits visible in any direction. There were no toxic tethers pulling me backward. There were no manipulative voices demanding my compliance or tearing down my achievements. My parents were locked away in a cold concrete cell, completely stripped of their stolen wealth and their destructive power. Ashley was permanently trapped in a mundane minimum wage reality, forced to finally experience the actual daily consequences of her own cruel arrogance. The massive suffocating shadow they had cast over my entire existence had been entirely eradicated by the blinding light of my own relentless success. I had taken the very worst they had to offer, and I had used it as fuel to propel myself to heights they could not even comprehend. I stood on the precipice of my newest international acquisition, feeling the warm sea breeze rush past my face. I had aggressively secured my corporate empire. I had fiercely protected my inner peace. I had systematically removed every single poisonous element from my life, replacing them with a chosen family that genuinely valued my mind and my heart. The heavy, restrictive chains of my past had been completely shattered, leaving nothing but an open, magnificent future in their wake. I took another slow sip of champagne, closing my eyes and breathing in the sweet, salty air. The world was finally mine. I had finally achieved absolute unbreakable freedom. If my journey has taught me anything, it is that blood does not automatically grant someone a permanent unconditional pass to destroy your peace. For decades, I operated under the crushing, suffocating delusion that familial loyalty required absolute sacrifice. I believed that if I simply worked harder, achieved more, and accommodated their endless demands, my parents and my sister would finally see my worth. They never did. Narcissism and entitlement are bottomless pits. You cannot heal toxic people by allowing them to break you into pieces. True power, absolute freedom, begins the exact moment you stop seeking validation from those who are fundamentally incapable of giving it. Walking away from your biological family is often portrayed as a tragedy. I am here to tell you that it can be your greatest triumph. When I finally stopped trying to salvage the ashes of a family that never truly existed, I created the space to build an empire. I replaced the relentless, draining criticism with chosen allies who celebrate my brilliance and fiercely protect my spirit. You do not owe your success, your sanity, or your wealth to the people who actively tried to drown you. You only owe it to yourself to survive and thrive. Have you ever found yourself shrinking to fit into the restrictive, painful boxes your family constructed for you? Have you ever had to sever toxic ties to protect your own future and mental health? It is a terrifying step, but the view from the other side is magnificent. Share your own story of breaking free in the comments below. Like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories of unyielding resilience, absolute justice, and ultimate triumph. Remember, your peace is worth protecting at any cost.